57 broken men. A captain drunk until noon. A hole in the wall through which you can see the forest. A 19-year-old boy was sent here to die quietly, but inside his head sits a captain from another world who spent 10 years bringing order to just this kind of hell, and he's only just begun to count. The first thing he feels is cold. Not winter's cold, but the kind where your whole body feels foreign and you don't know where your fingers end. Caden von Ehrenberg opens his eyes and sees a red mane, wet with sweat. Hands are clenched so tightly around the reins that the knuckles have turned white. But these aren't his hands. Too thin, too young. He tries to take a deep breath and his ribs respond with a dull ache. The body is weak. The body is someone else's. And it has been riding north for 3 days now, along a muddy road, surrounded by a ring of 10 horsemen who couldn't care less about him. Strange memories spill out of his skull, like items from an overflowing closet. Names, faces, the smell of his father's study, a slap from his older brother, the assignment order. To gain combat experience. Artem Kovalev, 27 years old, a captain and instructor in the tactics department, realizes 2 things at once. He is dead, and he is still here. He is riding to take command of something called Fort Kameny Zub. The horse stumbles and throws him about in the saddle so violently that he nearly bites his tongue. The escort turns. He looks at him as if he were a thing being transported simply because he was ordered to. He turns away. Artem grits his teeth and straightens up. His back aches. His muscles feel like a wet rope. Caden von Ehrenberg had suffered from a fever as a child, and his body remained that way forever. Frail. The 5th son of an impoverished family. Unfit for the sword, lacking talent for magic, sent to the border with one unspoken goal: to die quietly and not bring shame upon the family. Artem smirks. He knows that feeling. Not from someone else's memories, from his own. When you're written off not because you're bad, but because you're a nuisance. At the crest of the hill, the squad comes to a halt. The lead rider raises his hand. Artem rises in his stirrups and looks down. And this is where the real fun begins. A fort juts out from a ravine between the rocky slopes. The word fort is a bit of a stretch. A crooked stone box with a breach in the southern wall, a leaning tower, a blackened palisade that hasn't been repaired in 20 years. Something stirs at the gate. Artem squints. A formation, if you can call it that. People are standing haphazardly. Some are shifting from foot to foot. Others are leaning on a spear as if it were a crutch. He counts. A habit from a past life. 57, 5 old men, 8 teenagers. The rest are broken in various ways. Lame, skinny, with the empty eyes of those who long ago stopped hoping for anything good. A man in an officer's tunic with an unbuttoned collar sways in front of the formation. You can even see it from the hill. He's drunk. The garrison captain, drunk by noon, welcoming the new commandant. Artem exhales. And inside, for the first time in 3 days, something clicks. Not fear, not confusion. A mechanism that had been on pause springs into action. Chaos. Complete, classic army chaos. A breakdown of discipline. Zero supplies. The troops are on the verge of being combat ineffective. The commander is drunk. He's seen this before. He's dealt with this. For 10 years, that's exactly what he's been doing. Restoring order where everything was falling apart. Feeding those whom no one else wanted to feed. Building a system out of chaos. The horse is heading down the slope. Artem is no longer holding the horse's mane. He looks at the breach in the wall, at the tower, at the 57 people who aren't even trying to stand up straight. And he thinks, not about magic, not about rebirth. He thinks that the southern wall needs to be repaired before the cold sets in. That the warehouse is surely empty or has been looted. That these people need a hot meal and a decent night's sleep. That the drunk captain shouldn't be broken but redirected. He jumps down at the gate, clumsily. His body feels foreign and his legs buckle. The guard standing nearby smirks. Artem straightens up. His entire short frame, narrow shoulders, the gaunt face of a boy who's been sent here to die. The captain strides toward him. His name is Holtz, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a red face and cloudy eyes. He opens his mouth to deliver a welcome speech he'd been rehearsing since morning between drinks. Artem cuts him off. Says he needs the warehouse. The duty log. The list of personnel by. Today. Holtz blinks. He looks at the skinny kid. He laughs, hoarsely and condescendingly. He says that his lordship must be tired from the journey and can rest first. Artem doesn't smile. He repeats himself. The warehouse, the logbook, the list, today. Something in his voice stifles Holtz's laughter. Maybe it's his tone. Maybe it's his gaze. The gaze of a man who's been in command for 10 years and knows the difference between a request and an order. Holtz nods. He barks an order for the squad to stand at attention, and he leads the new commandant to the warehouse. The warehouse is a disaster. Artem freezes in the doorway. The smell hits him first. Dampness and rot. The roof is leaking in 3 places. Sacks of grain are piled right on the floor. Half of them are damp. He counts. 42 sacks. The logbook surely lists more. He'll check. Weapons hang on the walls. 12 spears. 8 with cracked shafts. 6 swords. 2 axes. 1 suit of chainmail 2 sizes too big for anyone serving here. He kicks the barrels. 3 out of 5 are empty. He finds some salted meat. He sniffs it.
It'll be good to eat for another week.
After that, no. Holtz's expression darkens behind him. Artem turns around. He asks when the garrison last received a proper supply. Holtz is silent. Then he says, almost through gritted teeth, 4 months ago. And even then, not everything. 4 months. Artem nods. He steps outside. He looks at the fort, at the men still standing in something resembling formation, at the gap through which the forest is visible. He walks up to the wall and places his palm on the stone of the gateway arch. He's just leaning on it. He's just tired. And the world shatters. Something unfolds before his eyes, semi-transparent, as if someone had placed a sheet of glass over reality and written on it. Lines, numbers, names, arrows. He blinks. It doesn't disappear. He turns his head. It follows his gaze. A card hangs above Holtz's head. Name, age, physical strength, 17 out of 100. Endurance, 22. Morale, 9. Loyalty, 4. Hidden skill, field fortification, condition, chronic alcoholism, liver, right knee. Artem lowers his hand. He looks at his palm, then at the formation. The same card hangs above every person. 57 cards. 57 lives broken down into numbers. He closes his eyes. He opens them. They haven't gone anywhere. They're waiting. And somewhere deep inside, Artem Kovalev understands. The world has just given him the one thing he knows how to use best. Information. Complete. Accurate. The ruthlessly honest truth about everyone standing before him. Not a weapon. Not magic. Not a superpower. Just the truth. And he already knows what to do with it. He turns to Holtz, tells him the lists are no longer needed. He'll figure it out himself. He walks along the line, slowly. He peers into every face. He reads every card. 57 names, 57 stories, 57 problems that can be solved if you know where to start. He reaches the end. He turns around. They look back at him, with indifference. With the dull anticipation of people accustomed to the idea that nothing good will happen. Artem says that for today, the formation is dismissed. General assembly in the morning, a hot dinner in the evening. Someone snorts. A hot dinner, of course. A skinny kid promises a hot dinner when there's no firewood in the kitchen and the cook is sleeping off a hangover. But Artem already knows that the cook's name is Magnus, that he's 41, that he isn't drunk but simply hasn't slept for 2 days, that he steals flour, but not for himself, that his cooking skill is 73 out of 100 and his culinary potential is that of a master chef. He knows that Magnus needs 3 things: a decent knife, an assistant, and someone who'll tell him that his work matters. Artem heads to the kitchen. The kitchen at Stone-Tooth Fort looked as if something heavy had exploded in it about 5 years ago, and no one had cleaned it up since. The stove was blackened with soot. A single pot stood there, with a dent in its side. There were 2 knives and both were dull. Magnus was sitting on an upside-down bucket by the wall, asleep. The scroll revealed his condition: exhaustion, chronic malnutrition, an obsessive sense of guilt, a hidden ability, an intuitive sense of proportion, potential. High. Under the right conditions, he could become a chef on par with those at the royal court. Artem woke him up. Not by shouting. He crouched down beside him and touched his shoulder. Magnus sat up with a start, and looked at him with the expression of a dog accustomed to being kicked. Artem said he knew about the flour. Magnus turned pale. Artem said his sister was in the village with 3 children. Magnus stopped breathing. Artem said that starting this month, a sack of flour would be sent to her officially, from the Commandant's fund. On one condition, Magnus would run the kitchen properly, keep track of the food, ration quotas, hot meals twice a day. Magnus was silent for about 10 seconds. Then he swallowed. Then he asked, "What about the knife?" Artem said the knife would be there tomorrow, a good one. Magnus stood up from the bucket. He straightened up. He was a head taller than Caden, broad-shouldered, hands like shovels. The tablet showed how his morale had jumped from 12 to 21. In the space of a single conversation, Magnus said there would be dinner. Artem nodded and left. He still had 56 more conversations like that ahead of him, but not today. Today, there were 3 things to do: food, a roof over the warehouse, and a night guard who wouldn't sleep on duty. He found Holtz. The captain was sitting in the guard room drinking. The scroll showed his profile in greater detail than when he was on duty. Holtz hadn't always been like this. 15 years ago, he commanded a company in the House Koenig Army. He'd participated in 3 campaigns. He'd been wounded twice. Then something happened. The tablet didn't provide details of the events, but showed the consequences. Deep trauma. A sense of guilt. Alcohol as the only way to fall asleep without nightmares. His field fortification skill was 61 out of 100, one of the highest in the garrison. Artem sat down across from him. Holtz raised his clouded eyes. He was expecting a dressing down, or dismissal, or humiliation, everything that new commandants do to demonstrate their authority. Artem asked how many men could be assigned to night watch right now. Holtz blinked. It was a professional question, the first in years. He thought for a moment. Then he said 8. Maybe 10 if they pulled 2 off the day shift. Artem asked which spots were the most vulnerable. Holtz began to speak, and Artem saw his expression change. His eyes cleared. His voice took on a different tone, firmer. Holtz described 4 blind zones in the fort's defenses.
A breach in the southern wall.
A section of the palisade at the western corner where the logs had rotted. A blind spot behind the tower that couldn't be seen from any guard post. And a drainage ditch on the eastern side through which a person could crawl. Artem listened and memorized everything. The tablet confirmed every word. A survey of the territory revealed the same vulnerabilities. Holtz knew his fort. He'd simply long since stopped believing that anyone needed to know this. Artem said that starting tonight, the guard duty would follow his plan. 4 posts. 2 men at each. Shifts every 4 hours. And anyone who stays awake through their shift would get hot porridge with meat in the morning, personally from the cook. Holtz looked at him for a long time. Then he said there weren't enough men for a company of that size. Artem already knew that. The tablet showed that out of 57 men, only 23 were actually combat ready. Another 12 could stand guard duty but not fight. The rest were sick, too old, or too young. He said that for the first week, guard duty would be reduced. 3 out of 4 posts. Block the gutter with stones tomorrow morning.
That's a half-day's work for 4 men.
Holtz nodded. He stood up. He put the flask in his pocket. He hadn't finished it. Artem noticed this. They went out into the courtyard. The sun was already setting. The air smelled of wet stone and smoke. For the first time in a long while, the smell of something cooking wafted from the kitchen. Magnus was working. Artem walked through the fort, slowly. The scroll was running constantly. Every person he passed was highlighted by a card. He read them just as he had once read personnel files in the HR department. Bren, 54 years old, former transport worker for the House of Lorenz. Injury to the right shoulder. Cannot raise a spear above waist level. Hidden skill. Cargo accounting and distribution. Potential. Senior quartermaster. Gavin, 21 years old. Recruited from a village. Hides his literacy. Can read and write. Afraid that if anyone finds out, they'll force him to be a scribe for some lord, and he'll never return home. Potential. Staff officer. Tom, 18 years old. The youngest of the teenagers. Skinny as a stick. Afraid of everything. Morale. 6 out of 100. But a hidden stat. Visual acuity. 97 out of 100. Potential. Elite marksman. Artem stopped in front of each one and just looked. He didn't say a word. He just memorized them. They looked back at him warily, a skinny kid of a commandant walking around and staring. Weird. By evening, Magnus served dinner. Salted meat soup with grains. Watery, not filling, but hot. For the first time in half a year, Artem stood by the kitchen and watched as people approached with their bowls. The tablet displayed everyone's morale in real time. +1, +2, +3. Small numbers, but they were growing. A bowl of hot soup. Such a simple thing, such a huge effect. He knew this from his past life. A soldier who is fed and a soldier who isn't fed are two different beings. The first will think. The second will simply survive. At night, he sat in the commandant's room, a small cubbyhole on the second floor of the tower. A table, a chair, a bed, a candle. He laid out before him what he had found in Holtz's desk. The duty roster. The last entry was from 3 months ago. A supply ledger. The numbers didn't even come close to matching. A personnel roster. Incomplete, with errors in the names. Artem picked up a quill. He dipped it in ink
and began to write.
a new list. All 57 names. From memory. From the tablet. Next to each name, age, health status, skills, and where they could be useful. He wrote until late into the night. The candle burned out. He lit a second one. It was quiet outside the window. The guard was on duty. He checked via the tablet. All 8 were at their posts. No one was asleep. Not because they feared punishment, because they'd been promised hot porridge in the morning. And they'd decided to see if the new commandant was telling the truth. Artem finished the list at dawn. 57 names. 57 lives. 57 challenges he needed to overcome to turn this rabble into a garrison. He knew where to start. On the third day, with roll call. From the moment he stepped before them and showed that he saw each one, not as a soldier, as a person. He lay down on the bed. His body ached, the body of a frail, sickly young man unaccustomed to either saddles or sleepless nights. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he saw before falling asleep was Holtz's card. Morale. It had risen from 9 to 14 in a single day because someone had asked him a professional question and listened to his answer. On the third day, Artem gathered everyone in the courtyard. It was a cold morning. Fog crept across the ravine and clung to the fort's walls. 57 men stood before him, waiting. Artem could see it in their faces and in the tablets of the scroll. The anticipation of something bad. A dressing down. Drill. Punishments. An exemplary flogging of someone to set an example. Everything new commanders usually do to assert their authority. Artem took out the list, the very one he'd been writing at night, and he began to speak. Not to give orders, just to speak. He called out the first name. Bren. Bren flinched in the ranks. Artem said that 5 years ago, Bren had worked in the Lorenz House supply train. That he had an injury to his right shoulder and therefore could not raise his spear above his waist. That forcing him to stand in formation with a spear was foolish and cruel. Starting today, Bren is the senior quartermaster. His place is in the warehouse, not on the parade ground. Bren opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said nothing. Artem moved on to the next person. Magnus, the cook. Artem didn't repeat in front of everyone what he'd said about the flour and his sister. He said something else. That Magnus was the only person in the fort with real skill, and that from this day forward, the kitchen was not a punishment, but a position of responsibility. 2 assistants, adequate supplies, full responsibility for the garrison's meals. Magnus stood there, red as a beetroot. Then he nodded. Briefly, like a man accepting an order that finally made sense. Gavin. Artem looked at the thin, silent young man standing on the sidelines, trying to be inconspicuous. He said he knew that Gavin could read and write. Gavin turned pale. Artem said that starting tomorrow, Gavin would keep a log of the post. All entries, all reports. Payment in silver, and that there was no need to hide his literacy, since it was a strength, a valuable asset here, not a curse. Gavin swallowed. He looked around. No one was laughing. No one was pointing fingers. People were just listening. Artem moved down the list. Name after name. one by one. He spoke of things that people never told anyone. Not shameful secrets, just things that had never interested anyone. A former carpenter who'd been drafted into the army 10 years ago and hadn't touched a tool since. Artem assigned him to repair the barracks. An old man with sickly eyes who'd spent 20 years sharpening weapons in the supply train and did it better than any young man. Artem assigned him to be the armory foreman. A teenager who stuttered and whom everyone teased. The tablet showed that he had perfect pitch and could distinguish a person's footsteps in the forest from 200 paces away. Artem assigned him to the night watch. Listen. Don't speak. Listen. And one by one, the people in the ranks changed. Not outwardly, inwardly. The tablet showed this in real time. Morale, +3, +5, +8. Loyalty, +2, +6. It was like watching a graph creep upward. Only the graph was made up of living people. It reached 47 name. Orvin, an old sergeant. 61 years old, 30 years of service, 4 campaigns, 2 wounds, arthritic knees. Morale 23, loyalty 31. Hidden parameter, instructional talent, 92 out of 100. Artem looked at him. Orvin stood straight despite his aching knees. Back straight, chin up.
He'd been doing this every morning for 30 years,
Standing in formation, waiting for orders, carrying them out, remaining silent. And no one had ever once told him that he was worth more than just standing in formation and waiting. Artem said that starting tomorrow, Orvin would be the garrison's senior instructor. That all training would go through him. That his 30 years of experience were not a burden, but the foundation upon which this fort would stand. Orvin blinked. His jaw twitched. He tried to say something. He couldn't. He stood at attention, tears streaming down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. Artem didn't pretend not to notice. He simply nodded to Orvin as an equal and moved on. He finished an hour later. All 57 of them. Each received not an order but a place. Not a position but a purpose. Not a task but an explanation of why he was there and what he was capable of. The formation broke up. The men dispersed quietly. No one spoke. But Artem could see through the tablet what was happening. The garrison's average morale had risen from 11 to 32 in a single hour. Loyalty went from 8 to 26. These were just numbers. Behind them lay something else. For the first time in years, someone had looked at each of them and seen not trash, not expendables, not penal laborers, but living human beings with names and stories. Artem returned to his tiny room and sat down at the table. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, from tension. An hour on his feet in front of the formation, in a body unaccustomed to standing for more than 10 minutes. He looked at his palms, slender fingers, pale skin, no calluses, no muscles. This was the body of a noble teenager who had never done manual labor in his life. He needed to work on himself, but the tablet didn't work on him directly. He hadn't seen his stats, and he never would. He would learn his strength, his endurance, and his limits only through trial and pain, just like any normal person. He stood up. He did 10 squats. On the 8th, his legs started to shake. On the 10th, he fell. He sat on the floor and laughed, quietly and bitterly. 10 squats. An army captain, a tactics instructor, unable to do 10 squats. He did 10 more, fell again, did 10 more. From this day on, he would do this every morning, adding 5 at a time. In a month, it would be 50. In 3 months, 100. A body can be built, slowly, systematically, just like everything else. During the day, he walked around the fort and worked. The tablet showed him a survey of the territory. The report was long and bleak. The southern wall, a breach 3 meters wide. The stone had cracked. Repairs are needed first and foremost. The palisade, 12 logs were completely rotten. Replacement is critical. The well. The water is clean, but the lifting mechanism is broken. People are carrying water in buckets. The barracks roof. It's leaking in 5 places. The warehouse's roof. It's leaking in 3 places. The tower's roof. By some miracle, it isn't leaking. And one more detail. The tablet indicated that 3 versts to the northeast, beneath a hill, lies a vein of iron ore. Shallow, accessible. No one knew about it. Artem made a note of it. That could wait. First the wall. First the roof. First, the people. He put Holtz in charge of repairing the southern wall. Holtz hadn't had a drink for 2 days now. Not because he'd been forbidden to, because he'd been given work in his field of expertise, field fortification. He knew how to lay stone, how to calculate the load, how to reinforce the foundation. He walked along the wall, directing a crew of 12 men, and for the first time in years, his voice sounded like that of an officer rather than a drunkard. Artem stood aside and watched. The tablet showed Holtz's morale, 22. The growth continued. By the evening of the third day, Artem was poring over a map of the fort that he had drawn himself, from memory and based on the scroll's data. He marked the vulnerabilities. He marked the resources. He marked the people and where they were now stationed. For the first time, he saw the whole picture. 57 men, a ruined fort, empty warehouses, no money, no reinforcements, no attention from the capital, and the tablet, which tells him the truth about everyone, which doesn't give advice, doesn't help. It simply shows him what's there. All the decisions are up to him. He looked out the window. Beyond the southern wall, the forest was growing dark. Somewhere beyond that forest lay the gray ridge. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay things he didn't want to think about just yet. Right now, his war was here, within these walls, for every shred of morality, for every sack of grain,
For every person who could be pulled out of the pit into which life had pushed them.
Artem blew out the candle and went to sleep. Tomorrow he had to solve the water problem. The first week had turned the fort into a construction site. Artem woke up before dawn. He did his squats. He fell. He got up. He did them again. Then he went on his rounds. The tablet ran non-stop. Every morning he saw updates. The decision log displayed the results of his orders with a precision that was both frightening and gratifying. The decision from the first day, a hot dinner. The result, morale up by 4 among 43 out of 57. A side effect, Chef Magnus is secretly proud that his kitchen has been noticed. Kitchen productivity has increased by 20%. Decision from day 2, guard duty according to Holtz's plan, with hot porridge in the morning. Result, 0 nighttime incidents. Not a single guard fell asleep. Side effect, senior guard Werner talks with his colleagues over breakfast for the first time in a year. Decision from the third day, assignments based on abilities. Result, average garrison morale, plus 21, average loyalty, plus 18. Side effect,
7 people slept soundly for the first time in months.
Artem read these reports just as he had once read the summaries of military exercises. Data, trends, correlations. Only here, instead of equipment and ammunition, there were people. And he caught himself thinking he had to be careful. The tablet displayed people as rows in a table. Morale, loyalty, potential, numbers. It was very easy to start thinking of Bren as quartermaster 65 out of 100, instead of Bren, whose shoulder ached and who missed his wife. Artem shook his head. No, numbers are a tool, not a substitute for one's own eyes. He stepped out into the courtyard. Holtz was overseeing the repairs. In 4 days, the crew had filled half the breach in the south wall. They hauled stone from a stream half a verst from the fort. Hard work. But the men were working. Not because they had to. Artem had set a simple rule. A 4-hour work shift. Break. A hot meal. Then another 4 hours. No work days from dawn to dusk. The body needs to recover. At first, Holtz looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he saw that the men got more done in 4 hours of normal work than in 10 hours of forced labor. And he stopped arguing. On the 5th day, Artem turned his attention to the water. The well was working, but the hoisting mechanism had broken 6 months ago. The gear had cracked. There was no replacement. People hauled water in buckets on a rope. Slowly. Painfully. A waste of time and energy. The tablet highlighted one of the older men. Dietrich, 58 years old, a former mill mechanic. His skill with machinery was 79 out of 100. Artem found Dietrich. He was sitting against a wall, warming his knees in the sun. Artem asked if he could fix the lifting mechanism. Dietrich looked at him. For a long time. Then he said he could, if there was wood for a new gear, and a tool. Artem sent 2 men to get wood. They found tools in the ruins of an old workshop, rusty but still usable. Dietrich worked on it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the mechanism started working. The bucket rose in 10 seconds. People stood and watched as the bucket rose from the well, smoothly, easily, effortlessly. A small thing, an absolute trifle. But the tablet reflected the morale of the garrison. +3 across the board. Every problem solved had the same effect. People saw that their lives were changing. Not tomorrow,
Not someday.
right now. And that gave them what they hadn't had in years: hope. On the 6th day, the first test came. A sentry on the western wall spotted movement in the forest. Artem climbed up onto the wall. The tablet couldn't see people outside the fort, but he saw them with his own eyes. Smoke. A thin wisp above the trees to the southwest. Someone was burning a fire in the woods, half a day's journey from the fort. Holtz stood beside him. He said it could be hunters, or vagrants, or bandits. There were plenty of the latter in the area. The frontier lived by its own rules. Artem asked when the fort had last sent out a patrol. Holtz paused. Then he said he didn't remember. Artem nodded. He looked at Skrizzle. He selected 5 men with the best endurance and navigational skills. 4 were among those he had reassigned. The 5th was a young man named Tom, 18 years old. Visual acuity, 97. Artem sent them out to reconnoiter. Do not make contact. Observe and return. Report on numbers, distance, and weapons. He put Werner in charge of the group, the former senior guard. His field navigation skill was 54 out of 100.
Not the highest, but better than the rest.
The group set out at dawn on the 7th day. They returned by noon. Werner reported clearly: a camp in the forest. 12 men. Armed. Axes and knives. 2 had bows. No horses. A wagon train of 2 carts. Sacks in the carts. They looked like the bandits who robbed merchants on the southern road. Artem listened. He looked at the map. The southern road bypassed the forest and led to the village. The very same village that was the closest settlement to the fort. If the bandits were here, then they'd also been on the road. And the village knew it. He asked Werner if they'd been spotted. Werner said no. On the way back, Tom said he'd seen a second set of tracks. Another group, further south. Maybe connected to the first one. Maybe not. Artem made a note of it. It wasn't time yet. 12 men in the forest. His garrison had 23 combat-ready men. Technically, they had the advantage. But his men weren't trained for combat in the forest. They weren't trained at all. Orvin had only just started training them. The basics. Marching in step. Working in pairs. The simplest formations.
It would take weeks,
Maybe even months, before they'd have any combat skills. Artem made a decision. Not to get involved for now. Reinforce the patrol on the southern side. Send Tom to keep watch from the tower every day. If the bandits move toward the village, it'll be visible in advance. He wrote this down in his journal. The first entry in the external threats section. Then he went back to work. 2/3 of the wall was finished. The warehouse roof had been repaired. The barracks roof wasn't done yet. Bren had tidied up the warehouse. He'd taken inventory of everything. Artem compared Bren's figures with the data from the tablet. They matched. Enough grain for 6 weeks at the current rate of consumption. Enough salted meat for 3. Artem fell into thought. 6 weeks. Then there would be nothing left to eat. There would be no supplies from the capital. The supply train from the Ehrenberg family wouldn't come either. He'd been sent here to die. They don't send supply trains to the dead. He needed a source of food. His own. The tablet displayed a survey of the land around the fort. To the east, beyond the hill, were abandoned fields. The soil was poor but arable. With proper crop rotation, a decent harvest could be reaped in 2 seasons. But 2 seasons is a year, and there would be nothing to eat in 6 weeks. He looked at the map. A village to the south, half a day's journey. There were people there. The people had food, and the people were being threatened by bandits. Artem began to think, not as a nobleman, as a logistics officer. The task, to secure food and resources. The 4 of them arrived at the village. Artem, Holtz, Orvin, and Gavin with his notebook. Artem deliberately chose not to bring more people. 20 armed soldiers at the village gates posed a threat. 4 of them, one of whom was a boy commander, meant there was room for discussion. The village was called Birchen, 40 households. A palisade of thin logs that wouldn't stop even a determined goat. Fields to the south and east, pastures to the north, a river, a mill, a blacksmith shop. Everything was small, everything was poor, but alive. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Children ran through the streets. Dogs barked. They were met by the village headman, a sturdy man in his 50s named Henrik Lindgren, red-haired, with the heavy hands of a man who'd worked in the fields his whole life. He looked at Artem with an expression Artem knew well from the tablets: morality, wariness, fear. Not of him personally, of what stood behind him. Nobles from the fort had come to the village before. They took grain. They took livestock. They called it a tax or a requisition or in the king's name. They left behind less than what was needed to survive, and then they left. Henrik expected the same. Artem asked to speak with him. Henrik led him into his house, a cramped room, a table, benches, the smell of bread and smoke. An old scythe hung on the wall, sharpened so finely it could be used for shaving. A red-haired face peered out from the doorway to the back room. A girl, freckled, curious eyes. She looked at Artem. Artem looked at her. Scrigil unfolded a card. Hannah Lindgren, 19 years old, the village headman's daughter. Herbalism skill, 68 out of 100. Potential, a high-class field healer. Current condition, chronic exhaustion, fear of the dark, childhood trauma, fever at age 7, barely survived. Hidden skill, empathy, 91 out of 100. She treated people. People from the 3 surrounding villages came to her. She never turned anyone away, and no one ever asked how she herself was doing. Artem looked away. He focused on the village elder. Heinrich sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He waited. Artem began to speak, simply, without titles or formalities. He said that he was the new commandant of Stonetooth, that the fort was being rebuilt, that in the forest to the west stood a bandit hideout. 12 men, possibly more, and that in a week or a month they would come to the village. Heinrich wasn't surprised. He said he knew that they had already come twice. Bandit hideout. 12 men, possibly more, and that in a week or a month they would come to the village. Heinrich wasn't surprised. He said he knew that they'd already come twice this summer. They'd taken 2 cows and sacks of grain. They'd beaten up the herdsmen. He'd sent a complaint to the capital 3 times. There was no reply. Artem nodded. There wouldn't be a reply. The village was on the border. In the capital, a struggle for the regency was underway. No one cared about 40 households and 2 stolen cows. He said he was proposing something else. The fort would take the village under its protection. Patrols on the road. A garrison unit ready to deploy on alert. In exchange, the village would supply the fort with provisions. Grain, meat, and vegetables. Not a levy. Not a requisition. A contract. In writing. With signatures, and with quotas the village could actually meet. Heinrich was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "What if the fort takes more than it promised?" Artem looked at Gavin. Gavin opened his notebook. Artem dictated the figures. He'd calculated them the night before. How much the village could provide without starving, how much the fort needed to survive, the gap between those numbers, and the exact weekly quantities. Heinrich listened. His expression changed. He wasn't used to seeing a nobleman do the math. Nobles didn't do the math. Nobles just took what they wanted. Artem said that the agreement would be drawn up in 2 copies. One for the fort, one for the village. If the fort violated the terms, the village had the right to terminate the agreement. Heinrich stared intently at him. He asked who would make the fort comply. Artem said no one, only his word. Silence. Heinrich looked him in the eyes. A 19-year-old boy, skinny as a rake, in a doublet that hung on him like a coat hanger. His eyes were different, older than his face, much older. Heinrich said he'd think about it. Artem nodded. He stood up. He thanked him for the conversation. He walked out. At the door, Hannah caught up with him. She said there were sick people at his fort. Artem stopped. She said she knew because everyone knew. That the fort was a place where they sent those no one cared about. That there were people there with wounds that no one treated. She said she could come once a week, if they'd let her. Artem looked at her. The tablet showed her condition. Exhaustion. She gave everything and received nothing in return. He said he'd be glad if she came, and that there would be a hot meal for her, and a room if she wanted to stay the night. Hannah blinked. Apparently, she was used to not being offered anything in return for her help. She nodded and went back into the house. Artem walked back toward the fort, lost in thought. The village. A connection to the village is more than just food. It's the people, working hands, information about what's happening around us, the mill, the blacksmith shop, resources the fort doesn't have. If Heinrich agrees, in a month the fort will stop being a lonely box on a hill and become a hub. A small system in which each element supports the other. Halfway back, Tom caught up with them, running. He'd been on watch in the tower. Gasping for breath, he said he'd seen movement on the southern road. A group of people, 10 or 12, heading toward the village, from the direction of the forest. Artem stopped. He looked at Holtz. Holtz understood without words. Bandits. Heading for the village. Right now. Artem clenched his teeth. He had 4 men. 4 against 12 armed men. No, not 4. He thought quickly. The fort was an hour's walk away. The bandits would reach the village faster. Send Tom back to the fort for reinforcements. Stay with the 3 of them. Take up a position. Don't attack. Warn the village. Buy them time. He sent Tom running. He said one word. Orwin. Tom understood. Orwin would lead the men out. Then he turned to Holtz and Gavin. Gavin was pale. He was 21 and a clerk, not a fighter. Holtz had already drawn his sword. Artem said they were going back to the village. Quickly. Heinrich had to know. They ran. Artem ran, his body failing him with every step. His lungs were on fire. His knees were shaking. The frail body of 19-year-old Caden wasn't built for running. He ran anyway. They burst into the village. Artem found Heinrich. He gasped out 2 words. "The bandits are coming!" Heinrich turned pale. Then he clenched his jaw. Then he grabbed that scythe from the wall. Artem told him not to. He said reinforcements from the fort would arrive in an hour. Maybe sooner if Orvin hurried the men along. "We need to close the gates. Gather the people in the center of the village. Don't stick your heads out." Heinrich looked at him. At the boy who was gasping for breath and whose hands were shaking from running. And he did as he was told. Because the voice was the same. Calm. Clear. The voice of a man who knows what he's doing. Artem stationed Holtz at the gate. Gavin, with his notebook, on the roof of the mill. Watch. Count. Take notes. He himself stood by the palisade and waited. 20 minutes later they appeared. From the forest. Not 12. 14. Better armed than Werner had said. 3 bows, axes, 2 swords. They walked confidently, expecting no resistance. Artem watched them through a crack in the palisade. The tablet didn't work on strangers. He saw only what his eyes could see. 14 men. Tired faces. Tattered clothes. Not professional soldiers. Former peasants. Former vagabonds. People whom hunger and impunity had turned into predators. Their leader walked in front. A big man, with an axe slung over his shoulder. He approached the gate and shouted. Artem didn't hear the words, only the tone. A demand. The familiar brazen demand of a man who knows there's no one to stand up to him. Artem waited. Time passed. The leader shouted again. He struck the gate with the back of the axe. The wood shook. Artem counted the minutes. 20, 30, 40. In the 42nd minute he heard it. The pounding of feet. Many feet. Orvin was running. A detachment rolled out from behind the hill. Not in formation. Running. Breathing heavily. 20 men. Orvin led the way, sword in hand, his face causing the bandits to recoil. 61 years old. Arthritic knees. But this man had been running his whole life. And he ran when it mattered. The bandits saw the armed men and froze. 14 against 20. No cover. No plan. The leader assessed the situation. He turned around. He shouted to his men. They ran back toward the forest. Orvin looked at Artem, without a word. Artem shook his head. Don't pursue them. Not now. His men weren't ready for a fight in the forest. A pursuit means chaos, and chaos means casualties. The bandits will hide. They'll return. But not today. Today the village is intact. Heinrich stepped out from behind the gate. He looked at Artem. At the 20 soldiers standing there, breathing heavily and leaning on their knees. At the young commandant, whose face was gray from running. Genrich said he agreed to the treaty. Artem nodded. He turned to Gavin. Write it down, he said. And Gavin sat right on the ground by the mill and began to write. The first treaty between Fort Stonetooth and the village of Birchen. On defense, on supplies, on the fact that no one would help the people on the border except each other. Hannah came out to them with a jug of water. She handed it out to the soldiers, one to each of them, with every word. Drink, rest. You ran well. The first month had ended, and Fort Stonetooth had become a different place. Not a good one. Not a strong one.
Just a living one.
The southern wall stood. Holtz had finished the masonry on the 23rd day, and Artem saw the captain run his hand over the stone and stand there like that for a few seconds. The tablet showed Holtz's morale. 41. A month ago it had been 9. The roofs were no longer leaking. The well was working. The warehouse was clean and dry. Bren kept such meticulous records that Artem checked his figures against the tablet, and every time they matched down to the last sack. The first shipment from Birchen arrived 10 days after the contract was signed. 2 carts. Grain, dried meat, root vegetables, a barrel of salted fish. Magnus stood at the gate when the carts drove in and silently felt the sacks. He checked them. He sniffed them. Then he turned to Artem and nodded. Briefly, like a master who accepts materials and knows what to do with them. From that day on, the fort served hot meals twice a day. Porridge in the morning, meat soup in the evening. The scroll was showing results. The garrison's average physical strength score had risen by 7 points in a month. Simply from the food. Simply because people were no longer starving. Orvin ran training sessions every day. 2 hours in the morning, an hour and a half in the evening. Following the regimen Artem had devised based on the tablet's data, each soldier trained in his own discipline. Tom practiced archery. He used an old crooked bow they'd found in the storeroom. He hit a post from 50 paces 3 times out of 5. In 2 weeks, it would be 4 out of 5. The tablet displayed a graph of his progress, and it was rising steadily and confidently. Werner was learning to lead a patrol. 3 teenagers were mastering the spear under Orvin's guidance. Everyone was in their place. Everyone was doing what they did best. And for the first time in their lives, each of them could see that they were getting better. Not just because their commander said so, but based on the results. Artem stood on the wall every morning and looked out at the forest. The bandits hadn't left. Tom had seen their campfires. They'd moved further east but hadn't gone away. They were waiting, or gathering reinforcements Artem didn't know. The tablet couldn't see anyone who wasn't his subordinate. Outside the fort's walls, he was blind. And that troubled him more than anything else.
He could know everything about each of his men,
but nothing about what lay in wait outside. On the 30th day, Hannah arrived at the fort, just as she had promised, with a knapsack full of herbs and ointments. Artem assigned her a room on the first floor of the barracks, a small one, but with a window facing east. He knew from the scroll that she was afraid of the dark. The morning sun was his solution to that problem. He didn't tell her why the window faced east. He simply said it was the best room available. Hannah looked at the window, at the light flooding the stone floor, and her face did what Artem had seen dozens of times in this fort. A moment of distrust, then understanding, then something soft and bewildered. She got to work right away. She examined everyone. 57 people in 2 days. She found something wrong with each one. Old wounds that had healed crookedly, bad teeth, skin diseases from the dampness, chronic coughs in those who slept in barracks with leaky roofs. She compiled a list and brought it to Artem. Long, detailed, written in large, uneven handwriting. Artem read it and compared it to the data from the tablet. Everything matched. Hannah saw the same things as his system, only without the system, just with her eyes, just with her hands, simply because she knew how to look at a sick person and see what was wrong. He told her she needed assistance. She replied that she could handle it on her own. He said she wouldn't be able to handle it, that she was suffering from chronic exhaustion, and that if she continued working alone, she'd be bedridden herself in 6 months. Hannah fell silent. She looked at him strangely. She asked how he knew about her exhaustion. Artem said he could tell by her hands. The tremors, the pale nails, the dark circles under her eyes. It was true, partly. He really had seen it even without the scroll, just not quite as accurately. Hannah didn't quite believe him, but she didn't argue either. He assigned her 2 assistants, young soldiers, boys who, according to the tablet, had a knack for medicine and were dexterous with their hands. Hannah looked at them skeptically. A week later, she was already teaching them how to bandage wounds and scolding them for their mistakes louder than Orvin scolded the recruits. Hannah was loud. Hannah said what she thought. Hannah could tell a knight he had a fungal infection on his feet with the same tone she used to say, "Good morning." The soldiers adored her. They were a little afraid of her, and they obeyed her, because she was the only one who treated them not out of duty, but because she truly cared. In the middle of the 2nd month, a problem arose that Art had been expecting. The bandits had returned, not to the village, but to the road. They had intercepted a trade convoy of 2 wagons heading to Birchen from the south. They killed the driver and took the goods. Tom saw smoke from the tower. Artem went upstairs and stood there for a long time, looking south. This changed the situation. The bandits weren't just living in the forest, they controlled the road. As long as the road was blocked, the village was cut off from trade. And without trade, the village wouldn't be able to fulfill the agreement. Because they had their own grain, but they bought salt and iron from merchants. No merchants, no salt. No salt, no salted meat for the winter. The chain of events was simple and brutal. Artem gathered Holtz and Orvin. He said it was time. Orvin asked what the men were ready for. Artem replied with a question of his own. What did he think they were ready for? Orvin thought for a moment. He said that 10 men could stand their ground and not run. Another 5 could fight one-on-one. Tom could shoot. The rest? Orvin shook his head. Artem nodded. 15 fighters. Against a gang whose size he didn't know exactly. There had been 12. Now there were 14. It could have been 20. He began to plan. Not a battle, an operation. He was used to thinking in terms of operations rather than battles. A battle is when 2 units fight each other until someone falls. An operation is when you choose the place, time, and conditions and leave the enemy any chance. For 3 days, he sent out reconnaissance. Werner and 3 men circled the forest from the north. They found the main camp. 22 people, more than there had been before. Newcomers had joined them. 2 huts, a fire pit, a livestock pen. Stolen carts, they'd settled in. They weren't planning to leave. Artem sketched a map on the board in his little room. The camp was situated in a low-lying area. Forest on 3 sides, a stream on the 4th. One trail led south toward the road. One trail led east toward a forest clearing. There were no other exits. He looked at it and saw not a camp but a trap. One waiting for someone to slam the lid shut. The plan was simple. 3 groups. The first, 10 spearmen under Orvin's command. Block the southern trail. 100. Do not attack. Just stand as a wall of shields and spears. Second group, 5 men with Holtz. Flank from the north. Block the eastern trail. Third group, Tom, alone, in a tree by the stream, with a bow. His job isn't to kill. His job is to shoot at the ground in front of anyone who runs toward the water, to scare them, to make them scatter. Artem will be with Orvin's group, not in the ranks, behind the ranks, keeping an eye on the entire field, with the tablet that will show him the status of each of his men in real time. If anyone falters, he'll see it. If anyone is wounded, he'll know instantly. He didn't know how to wield a sword, but he knew how to see, and that would have to be enough. The operation was scheduled for the morning, before dawn, while the camp slept. They set out 2 hours before dawn. 40 men in the darkness. No, not 40. 16. Artem took only those whom the tablet showed as ready. 10 spearmen, 5 with Holtz, Toma, and himself. He walked, and his body ached. 2 months of squats and jogs around the courtyard had done little good. He could walk 5 versts without stopping. Before, he couldn't even manage 2. But this was Caden's body, slender, pale, with lungs that, with every deep breath, reminded him of a child's fever. He walked in silence. Orvin walked beside him like a shadow. 61 years old, arthritic knees, and not a sound. Not a twig snapping, not a sigh. 30 years in the army had taught him to move in the dark like a ghost. The tablet showed the squad's status. Morale was fluctuating. For most, it ranged from 30 to 40. For 3 of them, it had dropped to 25. Fear. Normal human fear before the first battle. A boy named Lucas, who was 17, was walking third in line, and his hands were shaking so much that the spear shaft was tapping against his shoulder pad. Artem approached him. He touched his shoulder. He said quietly that Lucas was in the 3rd line. that they wouldn't get to him, that his job was to hold his ground and not run, nothing more. Lucas nodded.
The tablet showed his morale.
25, 27, 29. Not much, but enough not to run. They split up at the stream. Holtz led 5 men eastward, quietly. Artem watched them go. The tablet showed Holtz. Morale 53, loyalty 61, fear 12. Holtz wasn't afraid. Holtz knew what he was doing. Tom climbed a tree, silently. Artem saw his stats on the tablet. Visual acuity 97, morale 36, fear 20, concentration 89. Tom was afraid, but Tom knew how to shoot. And right now, that was more important. Orvan's group took up position on the southern trail. 10 spearmen, 2 rows of 5. Shields forward, spears through the gaps. The formation wasn't perfect, far from perfect. But Orvan stood on the right flank and held the line with his mere presence. Artem took his place behind the formation. He inhaled. He exhaled. Dawn was near. The gray sky beyond the trees was growing lighter. He waited. Silence. There was a stir in the camp. Someone stepped out of a tent, yawned, stretched toward the dying campfire, spotted the formation on the trail, froze. For half a second. Then he let out a roar. The camp woke up. All at once,
People jumped to their feet,
grabbed their weapons, shouted. Artem counted. 22. No, 24. 2 must have arrived during the night. 24 bandits. Their leader stood by the tent with an axe, giving orders. 10 of them ran toward the southern trail, toward Orvan's camp. Artem watched. The tablet showed his men in real time. Morale was dropping. 35, 32, 30. Fear was growing. The bandits were running toward them, howling, dirty, vicious, with axes and knives. It didn't look like a coordinated attack. It was a mob. But a mob of 24 armed adult men. The formation wavered. Lucas in the third row turned pale. His spear was shaking. Orvan barked a single word. Hold your ground. His voice cut through the morning air like the crack of a whip. The formation tightened. The spears aligned. The first bandit ran up to the formation and ran into 2 spears. At the same time. He fell. The second tried to flank from the left. He ran into a shield. He took a blow to the shoulder. He was sent flying backward. The third swung his axe, and Orvan stepped forward and struck him with his sword. Short. Precise. 30 years of experience in a single movement.
Artem looked at Skrizzle.
The formation's morale had stopped falling. It began to rise. 32, 35, 38. They saw that the formation was holding, that the spears were working, that Orvan was right there, and that Orvan wasn't retreating. That was all they needed. An example. A living example that it was possible to stand your ground and not run. 5 bandits retreated. 2 lay on the ground. 1 wasn't moving. The second one was howling and clutching his side. The rest in the camp were scrambling about. Some ran east toward the eastern trail. And there stood Holtz with his 5 men. A narrow trail, 2 abreast. Holtz in front, with a sword, without a shield. He didn't like shields. The first bandit ran out onto the trail, and Holtz met him with a blow that sent him crashing to the ground. The second tried to break through. Then the third. The trail was narrow. It couldn't fit more than 2 at a time. And standing on their side was a man who, 15 years ago, had commanded a company and fought in 3 campaigns, and who knew who he was. 4 of them ran toward the stream. Tom was sitting in a tree.
His first arrow struck the ground a step away from the man in front. The man jumped back. The second arrow flew even closer. The third. They couldn't see where the shots were coming from. They saw only the arrows falling in front of them like warnings. They stood up. They looked around. From the south, a line of men. Holes to the east. Arrows to the west. Nowhere to go. The leader realized this. He dropped his axe to the ground. He raised his hands. Artem stepped out of the ranks. He walked slowly. His heart was pounding so hard it was ringing in his ears. His body was trembling with adrenaline. But he kept his composure. Calm. Indifferent. The face of a commandant. He approached the leader, looked up at him.
The leader was a head taller. Artem said they had two options. First, lay down your weapons. Surrender. Those who haven't committed murder will get work on the fort's construction site. Food, a roof over their heads. Those who had killed would be dealt with according to border law. The second option, to continue. Artem nodded toward Orvan's formation behind him, 10 spears. Then he nodded toward Holt's on the eastern trail, then upward, where Tom was reloading his bow. The leader looked around. His men stood in the center of the camp like cattle in a pen. 9 were lying on the ground, 3 dead, 6 wounded. The remaining 15 were unharmed but trapped. The leader lowered his hands. He said he was surrendering. Artem nodded. He turned to the ranks. He said that Werner was taking prisoners. Werner stepped out of the ranks and began giving orders. Calmly. Clearly. Like a man who had run through this with Orvan 5 times in a row yesterday. Artem walked over to a tree. He sat down on the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him up. His hands were shaking. He pressed his palms against his knees so no one would notice. The tablet displayed the results. Garrison casualties. 1 wounded, Spearman Eric, with a cut on his forearm, not deep. Enemy casualties. 3 killed, 6 wounded, 15 surrendered. The operation took 11 minutes. Artem sat under the tree and counted. 11 minutes. His first battle in this world. Not with his own hands. With the hands of the people he had placed in their positions. Orvan approached. He stood beside him. He looked at the seated commandant. He didn't say anything, he just stood there. Artem looked up and said that Orvan had kept the formation in good order. Orvan nodded. Then he said that the boy Lucas hadn't run away. Artem knew. The tablet had shown it. Lucas had stood in formation for all 11 minutes. His morale had dropped to 22 at the moment of the attack and risen to 45 afterward. Because he didn't run away. And now he knew he didn't have to run away. That was worth more than any training. They returned to the fort around noon. With prisoners. With captured weapons. With 2 carts loaded with the stolen goods from 3 villages. Artem lined up the prisoners in the courtyard. The tablet had no effect on them. They weren't his subordinates. He saw only what his own eyes could see. Dirty, skinny, frightened. Some were very young. He asked each one a single question. Have you killed anyone? Most shook their heads. 3 were pointed out by their own comrades. That one killed the coachman. That one slaughtered the shepherd in Birchin last summer. That one, Artem separated the 3. He gave the remaining 12 a choice. Work, food, shelter, submission, or freedom. To head south and never return to the borderlands. 10 chose to stay. The 3rd month brought changes Artem hadn't expected. Rumors began to spread. A small, forgotten fort on the edge of no man's land had been overrun by a gang of 24 men, and 1 soldier had been wounded. 1 wounded man. Merchants talked about it on the southern road. Peasants passed the word from village to village. Soldiers from neighboring garrisons heard the stories and didn't believe them, and people began to arrive. The first to arrive were 4 deserters from Baron Draven's army, hungry, ragged, with the eyes of people fleeing from something terrible. Artem welcomed them into the courtyard. Skrizzle shuffled the cards the very second they passed through the gate and became his men. He read, first, Kurt, 31 years old, former sergeant, deserted because he refused to beat peasants who hadn't paid their taxes to the Baron. Morale, 9. Loyalty, 0. Sword fighting skill, 58. Potential. Squad leader. Second, a 16-year-old boy named Fritz. Squire. Ran away with Kurt. Morale, 14. Fear, 71. Hidden skill. Horseback riding, 73. Third and fourth, brothers. Bernd and Klaus, 26 and 22. Former peasants drafted into the army. Klaus limped, an old knee injury. Bernd never left his brother's side. Artem saw the same entry on their files. Injury. Loss of mother during a raid. He took all 4 in, fed them, gave them a place in the barracks, put them on the training schedule. He didn't ask why they deserted. He didn't demand explanations. The tablet had already told him everything. Over the next 2 weeks, 11 more arrived. Vagabonds. Former soldiers. Landless peasants. One was a former blacksmith from a ravaged village. Artem took in everyone. He read their files. He found a place for them. The garrison grew to 78, then to 83, then to 90. The fort could no longer accommodate any more people. The barracks were designed for 60. Artem put Holtz to work building an extension. Holtz hadn't had a drink in 2 months. His fortification skill had risen to 68. The tablet showed that, with the right workload, he would reach 80 in half a year. Master level. And then she arrived. Artem was standing on the wall when a sentry shouted that a lone rider was approaching from the south. On horseback. Artem looked. A woman, riding a chestnut stallion that was worth more than the entire fort. Straight back, a dark cloak, chainmail beneath the cloak. She rode through the gate without asking permission. She dismounted. She looked around. She saw Artem on the wall. Their eyes met. Skrizel unfolded the card. Seon Cho, 24 years old, lieutenant in the Royal Intelligence Service. Strength, 31. Stamina, 44. Dexterity, 62. Intelligence skill, 79. Melee skill, 54. Analytical skill, 83. Morale, 32. Loyalty, 0. Fear, 8. Chronic sleep deprivation. Morning hand tremors. Undiagnosed trauma. Rejected by everyone she worked with. Used as a tool. Never recognized as a human being. Current orders. Monitor the Commandant of Fort Stone Tooth. Report any behavioral anomalies or unexplained abilities. Artem read this and slowly climbed down from the wall. They'd sent her to spy on him. Of course. The boy commandant had broken up the gang and was building up the garrison. Someone in the capital had noticed. Someone had decided to check it out. And sent the best agent available. An outcast. A liability. But the best. He approached her. She was half a head taller than him. She was standing by the wall. A habit. The scroll had instructed her. Always stand so you can see the entire room. Always with her back to the wall. Never letting her guard down. Seon held out the scroll. An order appointing Lieutenant Cho to the Stone Tooth Fort garrison to bolster intelligence capabilities. The wording was straightforward. But there was more to it. Artem took the scroll. He read it. He nodded. He said, "Welcome." He asked if she'd eaten today. Seon blinked. That wasn't the question she'd been expecting. She'd been expecting an interrogation, a verification of her credentials, a cold reception, suspicion. Instead, she was asked about food. She said no. Artem called Magnus. He said the lieutenant needed a hot meal and a room, a private one, with a lock on the door. Seon blinked again. A room with a lock meant she could lock herself in from the inside, that she wouldn't have to sleep in the barracks with 30 men, that someone had thought about what it was like to be the only female officer in the garrison. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Artem showed her the fort. Everything. Out in the open. The wall. The barracks. The supply depot. The kitchen. The training ground. The map in his office. Gavin's journals. Bren's reports. He didn't hide anything. Not because he trusted her, because there was nothing to hide. Everything he did was out in the open. Every order, every decision, every result. Seon walked beside him and said nothing. She watched. She was memorizing it. Artem could see through the tablet how her readings were changing. Morale, 32, 33, 34. Slowly. Suspicion, high, but not hostile. Professional. She didn't understand. She saw a result that didn't add up with the cause. The fort had been restored in 2 months. The garrison had grown and was disciplined. The gang had been crushed. The village was under protection. The treaty. The records. The system. All of this had been accomplished by a 19-year-old boy, the 5th son of an impoverished family, with no military education or combat experience. It didn't add up. And Seon was smart enough to know that it didn't add up. That evening, she came to his office. She stood by the wall. She said she wanted to understand his management system. Artem showed her his logbook, training schedules, food rations, guard duty rosters. She read, silently, for a long time. Then she looked up. She said it looked like the work of a large military unit's headquarters, not a fort with 90 men. Artem shrugged. He said that good record-keeping didn't depend on the size of the garrison. Seon looked at him, with that same gaze. Direct, cold, professional. And Artem realized that this woman would be difficult to deal with. She wouldn't accept explanations about intuition or keen observation. She would dig deeper, quietly, methodically, until she found the answer, or until she decided there was no answer. He offered her some tea. She refused. She went to her room. Artem sat alone. He looked at the tablet, at Sion's card. Loyalty, 0. 0. Because she wasn't loyal to him. She was loyal to whoever had sent her. For now. He closed his eyes. He had to figure out what to do with a person who'd been sent to watch him, and who at the same time was the best scout he'd ever met in this world. He could push her away, keep her at a distance, give her menial tasks, and lose an intelligence skill rating of 83 out of 100. Or he could do what he'd done with everyone else. Give her real work, show her that here she was a person, not a tool, and risk her seeing too much. Artem opened his eyes. The choice was obvious. In the morning, he left a mug of hot tea with honey on her desk, and a note, one word, sleep longer. Seyon got to work from day one. Artem gave her what she did best, reconnaissance, comprehensive, systematic. She was tasked with mapping the entire border region within a 2-day journey's radius of the fort. Roads, trails, villages, water sources, elevations, forests, potential ambush points, potential hiding places. Seyon listened to the assignment. She looked at him, expressionless. She nodded and left. 3 days later, she returned with a map that was the best Artem had ever seen in this world. Precise distances, elevation marks, river crossings, every village listed by the number of households. She had plotted 4 routes along which a large detachment could approach the fort unnoticed, and 2 routes along which the fort could retreat if things went wrong. Artem looked at the map and said nothing. Then he said it was brilliant work. Seyon stood by the wall, her hands behind her back, her face stony. But the tablet showed morale, +4, because someone had said it wasn't just a good report, but a brilliant piece of work. He hadn't praised the paper, he'd praised her. She began going out on reconnaissance missions regularly, every other day. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Werner and Tom, whom Artem had assigned to her command. Tom was happy. A young man with 97 out of 100 vision and experience as a forest patrolman from an operation against bandits had finally found a role he didn't want to run away from. Seyon pushed him hard, silently. She'd show him something once. She'd wait for him to remember it. Tom remembered. After a week of joint patrols, Skrizel showed that his reconnaissance skill had risen from 22 to 31. 9 points in a week. Seyon was a teacher not by choice but by nature. She simply didn't know how to do anything poorly and demanded the same from others. And it was through Seyon that the first real news from the outside world arrived. Artem knew the general outline from Caden's memories. The king is ill. The great houses are fighting for the regency. The Church of the Holy Flame was gaining influence, but the details were stale, half a year old. Seyon brought fresh ones. She told him that evening in his office, standing by the wall with a mug of tea, which she now accepted without refusal. The king wasn't just sick. He was dying. Slowly. Months. Maybe half a year. The House of Koenig and the House of Waldstein are openly feuding over the right to appoint a regent. The House of Lorenz is biding its time. The House of Ehrenberg, the Caden family, is siding with the Koenig family. Caden's father, Reinhard von Ehrenberg, had secured a seat on the Privy Council. His eldest brother, Caspar, commanded a regiment of the Guard. His second brother, Dietrich, had married the daughter of Count Koenig. The third and fourth brothers were at court. All were busy with their duties. All were needed. Except for the fifth. Except for Caden. He was supposed to die quietly on the border and free the family from the embarrassment of having a useless son in the family. Artem listened and drew a map in his head. Not a geographical one, a political one. His family is the enemy. Not because they hate him, because he's inconvenient. A dead Caden would be more convenient, but a living and successful Caden. Artem imagined his father's face when word reached him that Stone Tooth Fort had been rebuilt and was thriving. It wouldn't be joy. It would be rage. Because a dead son doesn't disrupt plans, but a living one disrupts everything. Seyon told him one more thing. Baron Alaric Draven, a neighbor, a border lord whose lands began 2 days' journey to the west. His men controlled 3 trade routes along the border. Officially, he patrolled the border. Unofficially, he provided cover for smuggling. The bandits Artem had defeated weren't just bandits. Some of them had previously worked for Draven. They robbed others. They left him alone. The old system. Artem broke part of that system when he destroyed the camp. And Draven will notice, if he hasn't already. Artem thanked Seon for the information. She nodded. She turned toward the door. She stopped. She turned her head. She asked how he knew she had tremors in the mornings. Artem froze. The note. Sleep longer. She understood. She put the pieces together. Tea with honey isn't just a courtesy. It's knowledge. Knowledge that her hands tremble. Knowledge that she isn't sleeping. How did he know? Artem said that for people who are chronically sleep-deprived, fine motor skills are the first to suffer. That during morning training he saw her reloading her crossbow and her hand waver. It was true. He really had seen it. But he'd seen it because he already knew from the tablet where to look. A half-truth. Worse than a lie, because it's impossible to verify. Seon looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said he was very observant for a 19-year-old. She turned around. She left. Artem exhaled. She didn't believe him. Not completely. But she accepted his answer. For now. He sat there, wondering how long he could keep balancing like this. Between truth and secrecy. Between the desire to be honest and the need to remain silent. Between the people who trusted him and those who didn't know the most important thing. The tablet flashed. He didn't realize it right away. Then he looked. A profile card for one of the new recruits. Kurt, Draven's former sergeant. Glowing a soft red. A warning. Artem studied it closely. Kurt wasn't sleeping. Kurt was sitting in the barracks thinking. His internal conflict indicator was high. Loyalty, 12. It had risen from 0, but 12 wasn't enough. And the red glow meant that a decision was brewing inside him. To leave or to stay. To betray or to trust. Artem stood up. He went to the barracks. It was late. Everyone was asleep. Kurt was sitting on his bunk. His eyes were open. He was staring at the wall. Artem sat down next to him. Silently. Kurt glanced at him. He didn't say anything. Artem didn't say anything either. He just sat there. A minute, 2, 3, then Kurt spoke. Quietly. He said he'd gotten a message. From Draven's people. That they were offering him a way back. That they promised to forgive his desertion. That they were offering him money for information about the fort. Artem listened. He didn't interrupt. Kurt spoke and his voice trembled. He said he didn't want to go back. That here, for the first time in years, he wasn't being beaten, he was being fed. And he wasn't being forced to beat those weaker than him. But he was afraid. Because Draven doesn't forgive. And if Kurt refuses, they'll come for him. And not just for him. The 4th month began with the smithy. Artem had known about the iron vein beneath the hill from day 1. The scroll had revealed it during the initial survey of the territory. Shallow, accessible, medium-quality ore. But for a border fort that buys every nail from passing merchants, even average ore was gold. The problem was that there was no one to mine and process it, until today. She arrived on foot, with a shoulder bag from which the handles of hammers stuck out. Small, muscular, with sunburnt hands. Artem was standing at the gate when she entered. Skrigil unfolded the card, and he read it for a full minute. Minju Park, 22 years old, master weaponsmith. Metalworking skill, 89 out of 100. Blade forging skill, 91 out of 100. Material appraisal skill, 84. Morale, 15. Loyalty, 0. Hidden trauma. Her magnum opus, a sword into which she had poured 2 years of her life, was attributed to another master and presented to the king. Her name was erased. Her work was stolen. She stopped believing that anyone needed her work. Current condition, chronic malnutrition, 3rd-degree burns on her hands, partial loss of sensation in 3 fingers of her left hand. And despite all this, sword forging, 91 out of 100. Artem came down to her. She looked up at him. She wasn't tall, she came up to his shoulder. Her eyes were dark, wary, and angry. She said she'd heard that the fort needed a blacksmith. That she was a blacksmith. That she needed shelter and food. Nothing more. Artem said the fort didn't need a blacksmith but a master armorer, and that he had a job for her that no one else could do. Minju scowled. She'd heard that before, from people who would later steal her work. Artem didn't argue. He led her to where the fort's old smithy stood. A shed, an anvil with a crack, leaky bellows, a bell from which bricks were spilling out. Minju surveyed everything, silently. She touched the anvil, checked the crack with her finger. She looked at the forge, at the bellows. She turned to him. She said that this wasn't a smithy but a grave for tools. Artem said he knew, and that he'd give her the people and materials to build a proper one. Minju looked at him, for a long time. With that expression Artem had already learned to recognize. Distrust, expectation of a catch, a habit born of the belief that nothing good ever happens. She asked what she would have to do. Artem pulled out a list. He'd compiled it that night using data from the tablet. Every fighter in the garrison. Height, weight, arm length, grip strength, dominant hand. Old injuries that affect their ability to handle weapons. 104 people. 104 individual data sets. He said he needed weapons. Not just any weapons. Weapons for each of them, based on their hand, their strength, their skill. A blade for a left-hander with a weak wrist isn't the same as one for a right-hander with a strong grip. And he wanted every soldier to get the one that was right for them. Minju took the list. She read it. For a long time. Then she looked at him. For the first time without anger. With something else. With interest. She said it was madness. That it would take 2 years. That no lord in the kingdom orders custom weapons for rank-and-file soldiers. Artem said he wasn't a lord. He was the commandant. And that his rank-and-file soldiers weren't expendable. Minju was silent. Then she nodded. She said she'd start with the smithy. Artem gave her 10 men, former bandits who were now working on the construction site, 4 of the new recruits, and Dietrich, an old mechanic who had been repairing the well. Dietrich and Minju looked at each other and in half a minute discussed the design of the bellows. Artem stood nearby and listened. The 2 craftsmen spoke in a language he understood only halfway, but the tablet showed them both, and the skills that complemented each other like gears in a mechanism. A week later, the new forge was ready. Not pretty, rough, made of stone and clay. But the bellows drew the fire evenly, the bellows worked, and the anvil was new, forged by Minju from a piece of iron they'd found in the rubble of the old tower. She'd forged the anvil from a scrap of metal, under field conditions. Artem stood watching her work, and realized that 91 out of 100 wasn't just a number, it was a miracle. She started with her first order. Artem didn't let her make swords. He had her make knives. 1 knife for every soldier. A good knife, not a combat knife, a utility knife. For the camp, for the kitchen, for repairs, for life. Minju looked at him as if he were crazy. They'd given her materials and a workshop and asked her to make knives. Artem explained. A knife is the first thing a soldier picks up in the morning and the last thing he puts down at night. If the knife is good, if it's comfortable, if it's made for a specific hand, then every day the soldier feels that someone has taken care of him, that someone had thought about him, that his hand matters. Minju listened. Then she said it was the strangest philosophy of weapons she'd ever heard, and she started making knives. By the end of the second week, she'd handed out the first 20. Each was marked with the owner's name. Each was tailored to the hand. Magnus received his first. A chef's knife with a wide blade and a balance suited to his enormous palm. Magnus took it. He turned it over in his hand, ran his finger along the blade, looked at Minju. Minju had turned away toward the forge. Magnus couldn't see her face. Artem could. Through the tablet, Minju's morale. Up by 11, from 15 to 26. In an instant. When someone took what she had made and she saw that it was a good fit, that it was needed, that her work mattered. But the key moment came later. Artem asked Minju to make a sword. One specific sword. For Gavin. Gavin was left-handed. He had an old injury to his right wrist. He couldn't hold a standard sword. But the tablet had so far been saying that with the right weapon, his potential in sword fighting could increase from 13 to 40. A 3-fold increase, if the weapon was right. Artem described the task to Minju. A light blade, for a left-hander. A shortened guard for a weak wrist. An offset balance. Minju listened. Then she said that she needed to speak with Gavin in person. Artem nodded. They talked for an hour. Minju touched his hand. She checked his grip. She bent his fingers. She asked where it hurt, when it hurt, how it hurt. Gavin answered quietly and blushed. No one in his life had ever paid such close attention to his hand. Minju had been forging this sword for 5 days. Artem would sometimes stop by the forge and watch her work. Silently, intently, with the face of someone doing what they were born to do. On the 6th day, she called for Gavin. The sword lay on the anvil, simple, unadorned, bright steel, a short blade, light. Gavin took it in his left hand. He lifted it, turned it, made a test swing, and froze. He looked at the sword. He looked at his hand. He said it felt as if he'd held it his whole life. Minju stood by the forge, with her back to them. She didn't turn around. Artem watched through the tablet. Morale, 38, plus 12 in 10 seconds. Tears, which she didn't want to show, because this was more than just a sword. It was proof that she could do something for a specific person that no one else could, and that this person was standing in front of her, saying that the sword felt as if it had been his all his life. And his name hasn't been erased. His name is on the blade. Gavin. She engraved it herself. Artem stepped out of the forge. He stood in the courtyard and breathed. 104 people in the garrison. The forge is running. The village supplies food. Intelligence is in place. Training is underway. Guards are on duty. The walls are intact. The people are fed and clothed. 4 months ago, this was a corpse. Now it's a living organism. Weak, young, but alive, and breathing. He looked west, where Baron Draven had been. He would soon find out about all this, if he hadn't already. The first snow fell at the beginning of the 6th month. Artem stood on the wall and watched as white flakes settled on the courtyard, on the roofs, and on the sentries' shoulders. The fort was ready for winter. Not perfectly, but ready. Firewood had been stockpiled for 3 months, grain for 4, salted and dried meat for 2.5. Hannah had gathered a supply of herbs and ointments for the entire garrison. Minju had reforged all the captured weapons and issued each soldier a knife and spearheads. The barracks were insulated. The stoves were burning. 117 men. That was the current size of the garrison. Artem knew each one by name. The tablet displayed the average statistics. Morale, 51. 6 months ago, it had been 11. Loyalty, 48. It had been 8. Combat readiness. 62 men are fit to stand in formation and fight. Another 30 can perform guard and garrison duty. The rest are on support duties, in the kitchen, in the warehouse, in the blacksmith shop, and in the infirmary. Everyone in their place. Artem climbed down from the wall. He needed to talk to Seon. She had returned yesterday from a 3-day reconnaissance mission to the west, and what she brought back changed everything. Baron Draven had begun to make his move. Seon was sitting in his office, by the wall, with a mug of tea. She now drank tea every evening. Not because he'd asked her to, because she'd gotten used to it. The tablet displayed her morale, 47. It had been 32 when she arrived. Loyalty, 29. It had been 0. She still wasn't fully loyal to him, but she had long since stopped sending reports to those who had sent her here. Artem knew this. The tablet showed it. She had sent her last report 2 months ago, and it was blank. Nothing suspicious. The commandant runs the fort, period. She could have written a lot. She wrote nothing. Because she didn't want to. Because, for the first time in her life, she was in a place where she was treated as a human being and not a tool. And betraying that place was beyond her. Seon had told him, Draven is gathering forces. Not openly, quietly. He's hiring mercenaries through intermediaries in the southern cities. He's buying up weapons. He's negotiating with the neighboring border lord, Baron Gunther Haas. Haas controls the pass through the southern spur of the Grey Ridge. Together, they can field 700 swordsmen, maybe 800, against Artem's 117. She said that, in her estimation, the attack would come in winter, when the roads freeze over and become passable for cavalry, when the fort is cut off from the southern villages by snow, when no one would come to the rescue because there was no one left to help. Artem listened. He did the math. 800 against 117. Even accounting for the walls and discipline, it was too many. He needed more men, more time, more of everything. But there was no time. He looked at the map of Seon, at the approach routes, at the terrain, at the rivers and fords, and he saw one thing: Cold Ford. The place where the Grey River made a loop and ran so shallow in winter that cavalry could cross.
the only route for a large force coming from the west. All other routes went through the forest or over the hills, where cavalry was useless. If Draven came with 8 men, he'll come through Cold Ford, because half his force is cavalry, and cavalry won't trudge through the forest. Artem told Seon that he needed a complete reconnaissance of Cold Ford. Every rock, every bend in the bank, the depth of the water, the width of the ford, where the ice can support a horse, where it can't. She nodded, and asked if he was preparing for a defense or a battle. Artem said he was preparing for battle, because defending a fort against 800 men meant dying slowly instead of quickly. But fighting on his own terms, on his own land, on his own terrain, that was a chance. A small one, but a chance. Seon looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said she needed 2 men to go with her on the reconnaissance mission. Artem assigned Tom and Werner to her. She left the next morning, and Artem began to prepare. He gathered the commanders, Holtz, Orvin, Kurt, who in 4 months had risen to squad leader and whose loyalty rating on the tablet stood at 62. Eileen. She'd arrived a month ago, a former captain of a mercenary unit, the sole survivor of her group, tall, a scar across her eyebrow. She was drinking when she arrived. Artem saw her potential in the tablet and wavered. Leadership skill, 87 out of 100. Combat skill, 71. Tactical thinking, 69. Morale, 11. Guilt over the deaths of her people. He gave her a squad of 30 men. She selected and trained them herself. A month later, she stopped drinking, not because she was forbidden to, but because she once again had people for whom she was responsible, and she couldn't allow herself to be drunk when they depended on her. The tablet showed improvement. Morale, 11, 23, 31, 40, every week. Her squad was the best in the garrison, fast, fierce, disciplined. They loved her, but she was afraid to love them, because the last time, the ones she loved had died. Artem laid out a map in front of the commanders. He showed them the routes. He pointed out Cold Ford. He presented the calculations. He said they had 2 months, maybe 3, before Draven's strike. That during this time, they needed to bring the garrison up to 200. That they needed to prepare a position at Cold Ford. That they needed to stock up on everything they could. Holtz asked, 200 against 800? Artem said, it's not 200 against 800. It's 200 with a position against 800 on the march. 200 with reconnaissance against 800 in the dark. 200 well-fed, well-clothed, armed men who know what they're fighting for against 800 mercenaries paid in silver. These are different kinds of battles. Orvin said the men would be ready if Artem told them what to do. Artem nodded and told them to get to work. Over the next 2 months, Stone Tooth Fort turned into a military camp. Training doubled. Orwin pushed the fighters to their limits. Eileen pushed her squad even harder. Minju forged day and night. Spearheads, arrows, serrated knives, and horseshoes. Hannah prepared first aid supplies, bandages, ointments, and splints. She taught her assistants how to stitch up wounds. Bren took inventory. Leah counted everything else. Leah von Arenberg, Caden's 16-year-old second cousin. She'd arrived 2 months ago, sent over to visit. In reality, she'd run away from a marriage to an old man. Small, quiet, well-read. The tablet revealed potential that made Artem stop and read it twice. Arithmetic skill, 84 out of 100. Logistics skill, 71. Potential, a management genius. Artem gave her a job on her very first day, to help Gavin with the logs. A week later, she was keeping the logs on her own. 2 weeks later, she was taking inventory. A month later, she was planning the supply convoy. Winter settled over the borderlands with a heavy, white silence. Snow blanketed the roads and forests, transforming the world into an endless white expanse beneath a gray sky. The fort smoldered with 12 stoves. The barracks were warm. The people were well-fed. 203 people. Artem had carried out his plan. Every day, new people arrived at the fort. Former soldiers, peasants, vagabonds, fugitives from Draven, fugitives from Haas, people who had been cast out by the system and had nowhere else to go. Artem took them all in.
He read their cards. He found them a place. It was the same routine every time. A person would walk through the gate expecting the worst. A day later, he had a bunk and a bowl of hot food. A week later, he knew his place. A month later, he didn't want to leave. Artem stood on the tower and counted. 203 fighters. Of those, 140 are fit for duty. 30 in Island's squad, 20 in Seon's reconnaissance unit, 50 of Orvan's spearmen, 20 archers, 5 of whom are true marksmen, while the rest can merely pull a bowstring. 10 cavalrymen under Fritz's command. The boy had grown up. His horsemanship skill had risen to 81. Artem gave him horses seized from bandits and merchants. 10 horsemen isn't much, but 10 horsemen on the flank at the right moment is no small thing. That's the plan. Seon returned with a complete map of Cold Ford. Artem studied it for 3 days. The ford was 200 paces wide. The water was shallow in winter, reaching a horse's knee. The left bank was gentle. The right bank was steep. On the right bank, the forest reached the water's edge. On the left, there was an open field. If they took up position in the forest on the right bank and struck when the enemy was in the middle of the ford, half of their cavalry would get bogged down in the water and ice. If they cut off their retreat along the bank, the entire force would be trapped. Artem began drawing up a plan. 3 days, 3 nights. He redrew it 8 times. Each time he found a weak spot. Each time he fixed it. The tablet helped. Not with advice, with data. It showed him the capabilities of each unit, the movement speed of Island's unit, the firing range of Tom and his archers, the amount of time Orvan's spearmen could remain in formation without rotation, the endurance limit of each commander. Artem constructed the plan just as he had once constructed logistics schemes in his past life logistics schemes. Down to the minute, down to the meter, down to the individual. Every element had to fall into place at the right moment. Like a machine. Only this machine was made up of living people, and it could break down at any point. He gathered the commanders, spread out the map, explained the plan. The main force? Orvan's spearmen. 100 men, standing on the right bank. Not by the water, further up, behind the line of trees, invisible from the ford. When Draven's vanguard crosses the ford and comes ashore, the spearmen will form a wall. 100 spears, 4 ranks. Their task is to hold the bank. Do not attack. Hold your ground. Eileen's detachment, 30 men. A flanking route through the forest. A 2-hour march. It will emerge behind Draven's main column once it enters the ford. Strike the supply train. Panic. Chaos in the rear. Archers. 20 bows. In the trees and on the high ground above the ford. They shoot when the cavalry enters the water. Not at the men, at the horses. A horse in the icy water, wounded and thrashing, is an obstacle for everyone behind it. Fritz's cavalry. 10 gardeners. They're waiting behind the hill on the left bank. When Draven's formation breaks and the retreat begins, Fritz strikes the retreating troops along the bank. He drives them back into the water. He doesn't let them regroup. Reserves. 10 men with Holtz, in case of a breakthrough, in case something goes wrong. Artem will be on high ground on the right bank, with the tablet. He'll be able to see every one of his fighters. Morale, fear, fatigue, injuries, and he'll adjust the plan in real time. If the formation falters, he'll see who faltered and why. If Island's unit is delayed, he'll know and adjust the timing of the archer's strike. That was his advantage. Not swords, not numbers. Information. A complete, real-time picture of the battlefield. No commander in this world had ever had that. Holtz listened to the plan, silently. Then he said one word. Supply train. Artem nodded. The supply train. The most important detail. 203 people can't stand by the ford forever. They need food, warm clothes, a fire, bandages. Leah had calculated everything. A supply train of 10 wagons, food for 3 days, woolen blankets, firewood, pots for hot water, bandages, Hannah's ointments. The supply train would be stationed half a verst from their position, behind the hill, guarded by 10 men from the garrison. And Artem came up with one more thing. Wagons. 20 empty wagons.
that had been sitting idle in the fort. He ordered Holtz to fill them with stones and earth, and to place them on the right bank at the exit from the ford, across the way, like a wall, an improvised barricade. Cavalry won't be able to jump over it. Infantry will be slowed down. Holtz looked at him, then at the carts, then back at him. And for the first time ever, he smiled. He said it was a dirty trick. Artem said that in war, there are no dirty tricks. There are only the dead and the living. He wanted his men to be in the second category. A week before the planned attack, Seyon brought confirmation. Draven's column had left his castle. 650 swordsmen, not 800. Haas didn't send his men. He got scared or changed his mind. 650. Of those, 300 were cavalry. 150 were heavy infantry. 100 were mercenaries. 100 were the supply train and servants. Draven was leading the charge in person. Artem did the math. 203 against 650. Better than 800, but still 3-1. He gathered the entire garrison in the courtyard. 203 men. Snow was falling on their shoulders. Steam rose from their breath. Artem stood before them and spoke. No speech, no grandstanding. He told the truth, that Draven was coming, that they were outnumbered 3-1, that there would be a battle, that some would die. He said that anyone who wanted to leave could leave now, without consequences, without shame. The doors were open. He stood in silence. He waited. No one moved. 203 men stood in the snow and looked at him, and not a single one moved. The tablet displayed morale, average for the garrison, 64. It wasn't much. It was enough. Artem nodded. He said they would set out tomorrow at dawn. The Battle of Cold Ford began at dawn on the third day of a winter month. Artem stood on a hill on the right bank and saw everything. The tablet was running at full capacity. 203 cards, 203 lives. Each one pulsed with data. Morale, fear, fatigue, readiness. Below, the gray river carried dark water between icy rims. The ford was open. The shallows glistened in the faint morning sun. Carts stood on the bank, packed with stones. A wall. Behind the carts, in the forest, stood Orvan's spearmen. 100 men. Silent. Artem could see them through the tablet. Orvan stood on the right flank. Morale 68. Fear 14. The old sergeant wasn't afraid. He'd been doing this for 30 years. Lucas stood in the third row. The very same Lucas who had been trembling during his first battle with the bandits. Morale 54. Fear 29. He was afraid, but he stood his ground. Because he had learned to stand his ground. Archers were perched in the trees and on the hillside. 20 bows. Tom was among them. In the tallest tree, with the best vantage point. His eyesight was still 97, and his archery skill had risen to 61. In 8 months of training, the boy who used to be afraid of everything had grown into an archer whom Orwan called the best in the garrison. Eileen had left with 30 men on a patrol 2 hours ago. The tablet showed their movements. Green dots in the forest. They were in position, waiting. Fritz, with 10 horsemen, stood behind the hill on the left bank. The tablet showed his morale. 61. The boy was 16 years old, and he commanded a cavalry unit, and his men trusted him. Because he rode better than any of them, Artem was breathing, slowly, deeply. His hands weren't shaking. He was surprised by this. In his first battle with the bandits, he'd been shaking. Not now. Maybe because back then he'd been right in the thick of it. But now he was where a commander should be, up high, with a full view of the situation, with the ability to change the course of events with a single word at the right moment. Gavin stood beside him, with a notebook, with Minju's sword at his belt. He was recording the time, the conditions, and visibility. Artem had asked him to keep a chronicle of the battle, because afterward, they would need to analyze every minute. Because people would die, and their deaths had to teach the living something. They appeared at 9 in the morning. Tom whistled from the tree. Artem looked west. A column. Long, dark against the white snow. Cavalry in the lead. Baron Draven's banners. A silver falcon on a black field. 300 horsemen. Behind them, the infantry. Spears jutted out like a forest. Behind the infantry, the supply train. Draven rode at the vanguard. A big man, in fine armor, on a jet-black stallion. He hadn't expected any resistance. He was on his way to crush the fort. Some border boy had dared to ruin his business.
That border boy would soon learn what happens to those who meddle in matters that don't concern them. Artem looked at him and felt nothing. No anger, no hatred, no excitement, only cold calculation. The cavalry approached the ford. It stopped. Draven's scouts checked the water. They waved their hands. The vanguard began the crossing. The first riders entered the water. The horses snorted and balked. The water was freezing. The current was weak, but the bottom was slippery. The riders moved slowly. 10, 20, 30. Artem counted. He waited. Let more of them cross. Let them spread out across the ford. Let the middle of the column be in the water when the first strike is made. 50 horsemen at the ford. 70. The first ones reached the right bank. They saw the wagons. They stopped. They shouted back. Something was wrong. Artem raised his hand. Tom saw the signal from the tree. He whistled. 20 archers drew their bows. The arrows flew downward, not at the men, but at the horses, the ones in the water. The first horse reared up. The second fell onto its side. A rider went under the water. The third horse bolted backward and crashed into those following behind. The ford descended into chaos in 10 seconds. Horses thrashed in the icy water. People screamed. The riders who had reached the shore turned around and saw a wall of wagons, and behind it, a formation of spears. 100 of Orvan's spearmen emerged from the forest and took up positions behind the wagons. 100 spears, 4 ranks, a wall of steel. Orvan barked a command. The formation bristled. Draven's vanguard found itself trapped between the water and the wall. Chaos behind them. Spears ahead. Artem looked at Skrizel, his formation's morale. 59. It had dropped from 64. But it held steady. Fear had grown. But the spears stood straight. Because Orvan was standing right there. Because they trained every day. Because behind them was a man on the hill who saw everything and who had led them here not to die, but to win. Draven, on the other bank, realized he'd walked into an ambush. Quickly. He was smart. He ordered the infantry to cross at the ford. 150 men. Overwhelm them with numbers. Break through the formation. The infantry moved into the water. Artem had been waiting for this. He looked south. The tablet showed 30 green dots. Eileen. She was in position. Behind Draven's column. By his supply train. Artem gave the signal. A red flag. Gavin raised it above his head. 30 seconds later, a roar came from the south. Eileen's 30 fighters struck from the rear, at the supply train, at the servants, at the rear lines that no one was guarding because Draven hadn't expected an attack from the south. Panic. Screams. The supply train crew fled. The mercenaries in the middle of the column turned around. They didn't understand where the attack was coming from. The infantry at the ford slowed down. They looked back. And at that moment, the formation froze. Spears stood still. Archers continued to fire. The horses thrashed in the water. Draven's infantry entered the ford and got bogged down. Water up to their waists. The current, ice. Dead horses underfoot. They moved slowly, and 20 bows were firing at them, not killing, wounding, slowing them down. Every arrow in a shoulder or leg meant a man who stopped and became an obstacle for those behind him. Artem watched through the tablet as his plan unfolded. Minute by minute. Every element in place. The archers were firing. The formation held firm. Eileen was devastating the rear. And Draven's cavalry, which was supposed to be his main force, stood useless on the left bank because the ford was jammed with people and horses, making it impossible to cross. 40 minutes. Draven's infantry reached the bank. 50 men, wet, frozen, angry. They rushed at the wagons, at the formation, and the formation met them. Spears were flying. Orvan was in command. Kurt stood in the front row, slashing with his sword at anyone who tried to climb over a wagon. His eyes were empty and calm. The eyes of a man who is no longer afraid because he is protecting those around him. 20 minutes of hand-to-hand combat, the most terrifying 20 minutes. Artem stood on the hill and watched through Skrizel as morale plummeted. 51, 48, 45. The formation was buckling in the center. 2 killed, 5 wounded. Lucas was still standing in the third row. His morale was 38, the limit. A little more and he'd run. Artem shouted down. One name. Lucas. The boy looked up. He saw the commandant on the hill. who was standing there and looking at him personally. Not the formation, not the crowd, him. Lucas, morale, 38, 40, 42. He didn't run. Then Draven broke down. Not Artem's formation, Draven. His rear was on fire. Eileen had routed the supply train. The mercenaries began to scatter. The cavalry stood idly by. The infantry was perishing at the ford. Draven rode ashore on his black horse and tried to rally his men. He shouted. He gave orders. And at that moment, Fritz struck. 10 horsemen emerged from behind the hill, straight into the left flank of Draven's cavalry. 10 horsemen are nothing. But 10 horsemen charging at full gallop into the flank while everyone is looking the other way. That's panic. The morning after the battle was quiet. Snow had fallen all night and blanketed the field in white. But beneath the white lay red. Artem rode around the battlefield, slowly, at a walk. He stopped at the body of each of his fallen comrades. 41 men. He knew every name. The tablet no longer displayed their profiles. The dead had no stats. The dead were just bodies in the snow. But Artem remembered. Without the tablet, through his own memory, he dismounted at each one, placed his palm on their chest, and said one thing aloud. Something specific. Something he remembered. Jorgen, you promised to teach your son how to catch trout this spring. I'll teach him for you. Anders, your mother is in Grindel. I'll write to her myself. I won't trust the clerk. Bernd, every morning you brought your brother breakfast in bed and thought no one was watching. Klaus knows. He always knew. Werner, yesterday morning you told me that if we won, you'd ask Hannah to heal the scar on your face. I'm sorry you won't see her answer. She would have said yes. 41 names. 41 lives. 41 specific details that only Artem knew, or thought only he knew, because every detail was real. Each one was about a person, not a line in a journal. Seon was driving behind him, silently. She didn't say a word. She just drove, beside him, because he wasn't supposed to be alone. Artem hadn't asked her to do this. She'd decided on her own. The tablet revealed her moral compass. 59. Loyalty. 51. She was crying, quietly. He didn't turn around. She didn't want him to see. Eileen was standing at the edge of the field, leaning on her sword. Artem saw her from afar. She stood motionless. Her 30 men were alive, all 30. For the first time in her entire life, she had led her squad through battle without suffering any casualties. And now she stood on the field where the dead of both sides lay, and for the first time in 10 years she prayed, not to the gods. The tablet showed the way. The prayer was directed not upward, but to the side, toward the man on horseback who was riding around the field and placing a hand on each person's chest. For that man. Back at the fort, Leah was writing the last name in the logbook. 41. Her handwriting was steady right down to the last letter, but on the page next to the last name, there was a stain. Small, round. She didn't wipe it away. Artem finished his rounds by noon. 3 hours. 41 names. He returned to the hill where he had stood during the battle. He dismounted, sat down on a rock. His body ached. 8 months of training had made him stronger. He could run 3 versts. He could do 100 squats. He could stay on his feet all day. But the body was still Caden's body, slender, young, and tired. He sat and looked out at the field, at the river, at the ford that had become the grave of Draven's army. Draven was dead. His lands, by right of war booty, were passing under the control of the one who had killed him. Formerly, it was his own horsemen who had killed him in the crush, but Stonehtooth had won the victory, and everyone on the border knew it. Artem thought about what would happen next. Draven's lands consisted of 6 villages, 3 trade routes, a castle, supplies, people. This meant that Stonehtooth Fort would cease to be a fort. It would become a domain, a small border principality, and Caden von Ehrenberg would cease to be the commandant. He would become a lord commander. Artem closed his eyes. He didn't want to be a lord. He wanted to be who he had been, a man who restored order. Who counts sacks of grain and guard shifts and calories and rations? Who knows everyone by name? But the world didn't ask what he wanted. The world kept moving, and it dragged him along with it. He opened his eyes. The tablet flashed. Strange. Not like usual. The people's cards were in place, but a line he hadn't seen before appeared at the bottom. The line was flashing. He read it. Underground level. Access granted. Artem froze. Underground level. Beneath the fort. The tablet was showing him. Something beneath the stone, beneath the walls, beneath the foundation that had stood for 1,000 years. And now that something had been revealed. Artem stood up. He looked toward the fort. Somewhere out there, beneath the stone, beneath the earth, beneath 1,000 years of silence, lay something he didn't know about. Something the tablet had remained silent about until this very moment. He sat back down on the stone. Not now. Right now, he had 41 graves to dig, 41 letters to write, 203 minus 41. 162 living people were waiting for him at the fort, and they didn't need a Lord Commander. They needed their commandant, the one who would tell them that everything would be all right, and they would believe him, because he had never once lied to them. A winter evening, the great hall of Stone-Tooth Fort. A long table. No. 7 tables lined up in a row, because even one wouldn't have been enough for a third of them. Artem ordered that, for one night, the distinction between officers and enlisted men be set aside. Everyone is having dinner together. Everyone is eating the same thing. Everyone is sitting next to each other. Magnus had been cooking for 2 days. He didn't sleep the first night, and Hannah came to him at 3 o'clock and said that if he didn't go to bed, she'd tie him to his cot. Magnus went to bed. For 4 hours. Then he got up and continued. Roast venison. 3 reindeer that hunters from the Seon detachment had bagged last week. Hot bread. Real bread. Made from wheat flour brought from the village of Birchen. Root vegetables and honey. Turnips and carrots baked with honey that Hannah had bartered with a beekeeper from the second village for 3 jars of joint ointment. Spiced mulled wine. Cinnamon and cloves cost silver, of which there was little in the treasury, but Artem said there were evenings worth spending silver on. It was one of those evenings. The aroma wafted throughout the fort. The sentries on the walls swallowed hard and counted down the minutes until their shift ended. Orvin personally went around checking the posts and told everyone that they would be given a portion. Hot. A full portion. 162 people, plus 12 from the village of Birchen. Heinrich brought the people. The headman of the second village, a shepherd, a miller, a blacksmith. Hannah brought 2 of her students. They sat at the table with the soldiers and looked like sparrows among crows. Small, wary, but when Magnus set bowls of roast meat before them, they ate with just as much appetite as everyone else. People were settling into their seats noisily. For the first time ever, the hall was not filled with the silence of submission. There was a buzz. Lively, warm, voices, laughter, the clatter of bowls, the creak of benches. Artem stood by the far wall and watched. The tablet was processing data. 162 cards. Plus 12 villagers who didn't have cards because they weren't his subordinates. The garrison's average morale, 68. The highest figure since his arrival. 8 months ago, it had been 11. He looked at the people and saw both pictures at once. Numbers and faces. Statistics and lives. And he knew that one could not replace the other. Magnus sat next to Orvin, the cook and the sergeant. 2 men in their 50s who had been written off and forgotten, and who were now the backbone of the fort. They were arguing. Quietly and fiercely. Artem listened. A recipe for pickling cabbage. Magnus insisted on dill. Orvin demanded horseradish. They argued with the same seriousness with which generals discuss battle plans before a fight. Artem suppressed a smile. The tablet showed the morale of both men. Magnus was 71. Orvin was 69. They were happy. In their own way. In an old-fashioned way. With the quiet, everyday happiness of people who found a place where they're heard. Tom sat next to Fritz. 2 young men, one 18, the other 16. Tom told how he'd shot from a tree at Coldford. How the first arrow veered to the left. How he adjusted for the second. How his hands shook from the cold. How he lost feeling in his fingers after the 10th shot. Fritz told how he'd led the cavalry. 10 horsemen. How the ground shook beneath their hooves. How he shouted and his voice cracked with fear and excitement at the same time. How the horse beneath him stumbled, and he nearly flew out of the saddle. Neither of them was 20 yet. Both had been through battle. Both had changed. Tom was no longer the boy who was afraid of everything. His morale on the tablet was 58. 8 months ago, it had been 6. 6. A person with a morale of 6 is a person who doesn't want to live. Tom wanted to live. Tom wanted to shoot and run through the woods with Seon, eat Magnus's roast, and argue with Fritz about whose strike at Coldford had been more important. Gavin sat next to Minju. His sword hung from his belt. That very one. A light sword for a left-hander with a weakened wrist. A sword that felt as if it had been his all his life. He never took it off. Not even at the table. Minju ate in silence.
Her burned hands were wrapped in clean bandages. Hannah changed her bandages every day and scolded her every day for working without taking them off. Minju didn't answer. She just kept working. Gavin silently pushed a bowl of bread toward her. She silently took a piece. That was their language. They had spent 6 months side by side. At first it was because of the sword. Then because of the journals. Gavin kept records, and Minju would come to him to verify the measurements and grip of each new fighter. Then they began to argue. About steel. About tempering. About balance. Gavin read books on metallurgy that Artem had obtained through merchants. Minju scorned book knowledge and said that steel had to be felt, not read about. They argued for hours. And at some point, neither of them noticed that their arguments ended with a silent tea break in the forge, where Minju warmed her hands by the furnace while Gavin sat nearby with a book. Artem saw this through the tablet. He saw how their stats changed when they were together. Both of their morale rose. Both of their anxiety fell. They didn't understand it yet, but Artem did. And he remained silent, because some things have to happen on their own. Kurt sat with Fritz on the other side of the table, Draven's former sergeant. The man who had arrived at the fort 8 months ago with zero loyalty and an offer to spy on his new home for his old one. The man who had told Artem everything. The man who had chosen to stay. The man who had stood in the front line at Coldford and fought so hard that Orvin said he'd seen few better fighters. Kurt's loyalty rating on the tablet was 78. He was eating roast meat and laughing. Artem didn't remember Kurt ever laughing before. Not in all 8 months. This was the first time. The tablet showed his morale. Up 3 over the last hour. Just from the food and laughter, and from the fact that people he wasn't afraid of were sitting nearby. Hannah walked between the tables. She couldn't sit still. She checked on everyone. She touched their foreheads. She looked into their eyes. Eric's hand is healing. The bandage needs to be changed. Old Henrik's cough has returned. We need to brew a decoction. Lucas has a bruise on his cheekbone. Where did that come from? Lucas blushed and said he'd fallen during practice. Hannah looked at Orvin. Orvin raised his hands in a defensive gesture and said the boy really had fallen on his own. Hannah snorted, suspicious. But she accepted it. She couldn't stop. She didn't know how, because healing was the only thing she knew, and the only thing that made her world make sense. If someone was in pain and she could help, then everything made sense. Artem grabbed her by the elbow as she walked past his seat. He quietly said that she needed to eat too. Hannah looked at him, from head to toe. She was the same height as him, but at that moment she seemed taller. Green eyes, freckles. Her expression was both stubborn and bewildered. She opened her mouth, closed it, blushed all the way to the roots of her red hair. Then she sat down next to him, heavily, like someone who had finally given in and allowed herself to stop. She began to eat, in silence. Artem slid a mug of mulled wine toward her. She took it, took a sip, closed her eyes for a second. And between her 4th and 5th piece of bread, she said she was in love with him, as simply as saying it was snowing outside, in front of everyone, loudly, just like she did everything. The table froze for half a second, as if someone had pressed pause. Then the sound returned. Orvin grunted and stared into his bowl with exaggerated concentration. Magnus choked on the hot wine and coughed so hard that Orvin started patting him on the back. Tom blushed to his ears and stared at the table. Fritz laughed, openly, cheerfully, and without malice. Kurt looked at Hannah with an expression of quiet respect. Minhu didn't turn her head. Gavin jotted something down in his notebook, and Artem later realized it was the date and time, along with a note that read, Hannah said. Hannah sat with her back straight and a completely impassive expression, as if she'd just delivered the weather forecast. Artem looked at her freckles, at her red hair which she never tied back and which was always getting in her eyes, at her hands. Strong, calloused from the mortar and scissors, hands that healed someone else's pain every day, and to which no one had ever said they deserved a rest. The tablet displayed her profile. Morality, 63. Fear, 8. Sincerity, maximum. Hannah didn't know how to lie, physically. She said what she thought because she didn't know how else to do it. And right now, she thought she was in love, and she said so. He said he heard her. and that they'd talk about it later. Not because he didn't want to, but because there are things you don't say at a table with 160 people. Hannah nodded. She smiled, broadly and without hesitation. It was clear that this answer satisfied her. She wasn't expecting a confession in return. She'd simply told the truth, as she always did. And the truth doesn't require an answer, only acknowledgement. Seyeon sat at the far end of the table, by the wall, as always, with her back to the stone, facing the hall, a mug of tea in her hands. She was drinking tea, not wine, never wine. Her hands weren't shaking. For the first time in months, her morning tremors had subsided. 3 months of hot tea with honey every morning. 3 months of notes. Sleep longer. Then the notes changed. The report can wait until lunch. Then, Seyeon, you last ate yesterday. Then just, good morning. She never once replied to the notes, but she never threw them away either. Artem knew this. Not from the tablet. Gavin once mentioned that he'd seen a stack of notes in her room, on the table, neatly stacked. Seyeon looked at the hall and at the people, and at Artem, and her face was the same as always. Cold, professional, closed off. But the tablet saw something else. Morale, 59. Loyalty, 53. 8 months ago, her loyalty was 0. She'd come to spy. She stayed because she couldn't leave, because here they treated her like a human being, and because every morning there was tea waiting on her desk. And no one had ever set tea on her table before in her life. She caught his gaze across the room. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked, and looked away. But the tablet had spoken. A lesson. +2. In 3 seconds. Leah was sitting at the end of the table, with a notebook, even at dinner. She was writing down the ingredients for the holiday feast. How much flour for the bread, how much meat for the roast, how much wine, how much honey. Exact figures. Neat handwriting. 16 years old. A mathematical genius whom no one had ever taught because a girl didn't need to be taught. Artem looked at her and shook his head. He said quietly that she could close the notebook. One evening. Leah. One evening without numbers. Leah looked up. She looked at him with an expression of mild panic, as if she'd been asked to leave the house without clothes. The notebook was her armor, her way of feeling needed. Without the notebook, she was just Leah, a 16-year-old girl whom her entire family considered a commodity for a profitable deal. Artem said she was needed here not because of the notebook. Leah closed the notebook. Slowly. She placed her hands on the table. She looked around. At the people. At the candles. At the steam rising from the hot meat. At Magnus, who was arguing with Orvin. At Tom, who was laughing. At Minju, who was eating silently next to Gavin. At Hannah, who was sitting next to the commandant and smiling as if the world had finally become right. And Artem saw how the 16-year-old girl, who her whole life had been regarded as a beautiful object for sale, was sitting at the table as an equal for the first time. And she didn't need to prove anything to have the right to be here. The tablet showed her moral score. +7. In 1 minute. Eileen sat across from Artem, upright, broad-shouldered, a scar across her eyebrow. Former captain of a mercenary unit, the sole survivor, who had been drinking when she arrived, and who hadn't had a drink in 4 months. A mug of water stood before her, not wine. She could have had a drink. No one would have judged her, after the battle, after the losses, after everything. But sitting before her were her 30, alive, all 30 of them. She hadn't lost a single one at Coldford, and the mug of water was her promise. To them, to herself. That she would never drink again because she once again had people who depended on her. She was silent. She looked at her people. Her eyes were dry and warm. She caught Artem's gaze. She raised her mug, silently. He raised his. They didn't clink them. They just held them in the air and set them down. That was enough. There was something. Both knew it. Neither said a word, and neither was in a hurry. Both had too many scars to rush forward. But what was between them wasn't going anywhere, and it wasn't going to go away. Sora Kim sat against the wall in her usual spot, a wandering priestess of the cult of the road, a half-forgotten teaching the idea that holiness lies in the journey, not in the temple. She was 28 years old. She had been walking her whole life, from city to city, from village to village. Everywhere she went, she was driven out. Heretic.
Vagabond. Crazy. She'd come to the fort to spend the winter. She'd planned to wait out the cold and leave in the spring. Artem gave her a room with a stove, small, warm, with a window, and he asked her to be the garrison chaplain, not for the gods, for the people, who had no one else to talk to. Sora stayed, because for the first time in her life, someone hadn't chased her away, but had asked her to stay, because her room was warm, because Magnus left her hot bread and butter in the kitchen every morning without saying a word, because the soldiers came to her in the evenings and told her what they couldn't tell anyone else, about their fear of battle, about the mother they hadn't seen in 5 years, about dreams in which they were running again and couldn't stop. Sora listened. She didn't judge. She didn't try to fix things. She just listened. In her deep, calm voice, she spoke a single sentence. Sometimes that was enough. She sat there and drank tea. Her knees ached, as always. She looked at Artem across the hall and smiled, quietly, barely noticeably, like someone who had found what they'd been searching for their whole life. Not God. Not a temple. Not the end of the road. Just a place where she could be Sora. Artem stood up. The hall fell silent. Not immediately. Gradually. Voices faded one by one, like candles, until only silence remained. 162 people were looking at him, plus 12 from the village. He stood in the candlelight, thin, short, in a plain, unadorned doublet, the face of a 19-year-old boy, the eyes of a 27-year-old officer. He hadn't prepared a speech. He never prepared speeches. He simply spoke the truth. He named names. 41. Everyone who had died, not just at Coldford, all of them, from the very first day. Dietrich, the old mechanic, who repaired the well during the first week, who built the bellows for Minju's forge, who checked his mechanism every morning, every single one, even when his knees wouldn't bend, even when his heart ached. His heart stopped a month after the battle, quietly, in his sleep. The tablet showed his morale right up until his last day. 74. The oldest of the elders. He was happy. In the last months of his life, he was happy. Because he was doing what he knew how to do, and it was needed. Artem said that every time the bucket rises from the well easily and smoothly, it's Dietrich, his hands, his work, his mark. Jorgen, who promised to teach his son how to catch trout. Artem said he'd teach him in Jorgen's place. This spring, personally. Anders, whose mother lives in Grindel. Artem said he wrote to her himself. He didn't trust the clerk, and that she replied, and that she was grateful, and that she asked him to pass on that Anders had been a good son. Bernd, who brought his brother breakfast every morning and died in battle right beside him. Klaus survived. Klaus was sitting at the table. Artem looked at him. Klaus was staring at the table. He wasn't crying. He just couldn't bring himself to look up. Artem said that Bernd knew Klaus had always known about the breakfast, and that Bernd didn't want Klaus to thank him. He just wanted Klaus to eat. Werner, who asked Hannah to heal his scar. Artem didn't say that in front of everyone. Instead, he said that on the last evening before the battle, Werner had polished his boots. For 3 hours. He polished them until they shone. Because he wanted to look like a real soldier. And he did. 41 names. One detail for each of them. Specific, small, human. Tom always gave his portion of meat to Bren's dog and thought no one noticed. Eric sharpened his knife every evening. The very same one from Minju. Even when the knife was sharp. Just because he liked the sound of steel against stone. Henrik sang at night, quietly, when he thought everyone was asleep. An old song his mother used to sing to him. Artem knew because Skrizel had shown him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he remembered, that every name wasn't just a line in a logbook but a person, with habits, with dreams, with little secrets that made them who they were. He finished. He sat down. Silence hung in the air for a few more seconds. Then Magnus stood up and went to get seconds, and everyone began to eat, quietly, without words, without toasts, without fanfare. They just ate. And at that moment, 162 people simultaneously realized something they understood not with their minds, but with something deeper. They were home. Not in the fort, not in the barracks, not in the garrison. Home. Because home isn't walls. Home is when someone knows your name, remembers it, and will say it out loud when you're gone. Holtz was sitting next to Artem, the captain who had been drunk on the day of his arrival, who hadn't had a drink in 7 months, who had built the wall, and the annex, and the barricade of carts that had stopped Draven's cavalry. His morale, according to the tablet, was 62. His fortification skill had risen to 79. He quietly told Artem that it had been a good evening. Artem nodded. Holtz was silent for a moment. Then he said that when Artem arrived 8 months ago, he thought the boy wouldn't last even a week. Artem said he almost didn't, 3 times. Holtz grunted. Then he said seriously and quietly that he was glad he'd been wrong. Artem looked at him, at his red, weather-beaten face, at his hands calloused from working with stone, at his eyes which were clear and sober. He said he was glad too. After dinner, the hall emptied slowly. People didn't want to leave. They sat there, they talked, quietly. Magnus was washing the pots and humming something under his breath. Orvin was dozing on a bench. Sora had gone to her room, quietly, as always. Hannah stood by the door and looked out at the hall with an expression Artem had never seen on her face before. Peace. She didn't rush off to treat anyone. She didn't check on anyone. She didn't touch her forehead. She just stood there, looking at the people who were full, alive, and happy. And for the first time in her life, she didn't have to do anything to feel needed. Artem waited until everyone had left. The guards had changed shifts. The hall was empty. Magnus had left. The candles were burning down. He went downstairs, alone, with a torch. Skrizzle showed the way, beneath the tower's foundation, through a passage in the stone that hadn't been there before, or one that had been there, but the tablet hadn't revealed until today, until this evening, until the moment when the garrison's morale and loyalty had reached a certain threshold, as if it were a lock, one that was opened not by a key but by the people's trust. Steps leading down, narrow, worn away, old stone, very old, 1,000 years. The air smelled of earth and time. He descended for a long time. The torch smoldered. Shadows danced across the walls. Symbols were carved into the walls. He didn't recognize them. The tablet didn't recognize them either. Or perhaps it didn't want to reveal them. The steps ended. A corridor, low-ceilinged. He walked crouched over. Then the corridor widened. A room, small, round, a vaulted ceiling. In the center was a stone slab. On the slab were bones, human bones, old, white, clean. Time had consumed everything except the bones. Next to the bones was a sword, rust into the hilt. It had once been beautiful, a broad blade, an ornate guard. Now it was just a piece of rusty metal. On the wall behind the slab was an inscription, carved into the stone, deeply, so it wouldn't be erased. He brought the torch closer. He read it. Commander Orin, the last of the first, who counted but did not see, who commanded but did not hear, who forgot that they were alive. The tablet flickered, and for the first time ever, it showed him neither a person's file, nor a territory audit, nor a log of decisions. It showed him text, long, detailed, like the pages of a book that no one had written, but which had been carved into the very structure of the tablet. He read, standing in the darkness, next to the bones of a man who 1,000 years ago had stood in this very spot, had seen these same walls, had heard this same silence. Commander Orin was the first to receive the tablet, the first to see people as cards with numbers, the first to build an army based on data rather than tradition. He was a genius. His army was the best in the history of Waldheim. Every soldier in his place, every skill utilized, every potential realized. And he won. First, the border wars, then internal conflicts, then external enemies. Everyone knew his name. Everyone feared him. And then he began to count. Not people, units, resources, potentials. He stopped seeing names and saw numbers. He stopped hearing voices and heard metrics. And when the real threat came, when something that couldn't be captured in cards and stats crept out from beyond the ridge, he sent a 50-man squad into battle to buy time, knowing they would die. Because the tablet showed that their combined potential was lower than that of those he had spared. 50 lives for time. A reasonable trade-off, mathematically. Then he sent another 100, because the flank had to be secured. Then 200, because 1,000 had to be saved. And by the end, when the decisive battle came, his best soldiers, those who had been through everything with him, those whose names he once knew, refused to go. Not because they were afraid, but because he had forgotten their names. Because to him, they had become mere lines on a page. And lines do not go to their deaths for someone who does not remember that they are human. Orrin lost. His great army fell apart, not from the enemy's blows, from the emptiness within, from the fact that the commander who sees everything had stopped seeing what mattered most. That numbers aren't people. That potential isn't a person. That you can't sacrifice 50 for the sake of 1,000 because, for each of those 50, their life is their only one. Orrin came down here, into the darkness, alone. He lay down on a rock and died, slowly, in silence. And the last thing he did, with his final effort, was to carve into the wall not his name, not his story. A plea, a cry into the void, beyond the world. Send me a person who will not forget that they are alive when the hour comes. Send me such a person. Artem stood there reading. The torch trembled in his hand. His eyes stung. Not from the smoke. He understood. Everything. Completely. He hadn't ended up here by accident. Not in this body by accident. Not in this fort by accident. Artem Kovalev, captain, logistics officer, instructor in tactics and logistical support. A man who, for 10 years, had counted rations and ammunition, kilometers marched, and hours of sleep for his personnel. Who knew every cadet by name, every single one. Who died on black ice, his last thought being the fuel consumption report. Not about himself, about his work. He was the answer. The one who had been coming for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, this plea had hung in the void, waiting, searching, and finding. A man who knew how to count, and yet remembered names. He knelt down beside Orrin's bones. He placed his hand on the stone slab. The stone was cold, smooth with age, and he said quietly into the darkness, "I won't forget. I won't forget that they're alive. I won't forget that Bren misses his wife, that Magnus is proud of his cooking, that Tom has learned not to be afraid, that Orvin's beard catches on his belt when he salutes, that Holtz hasn't had a drink in 7 months, that Seon keeps notes, that Hannah speaks her mind, that Minju cries by the horn when no one is looking, that Eileen doesn't drink anymore because she has people in her life again, that Leah blushes when she's praised, that Sora loves hot bread with butter, that Lucas didn't run away, that Kurt has Fritz, whom he cares for like a younger brother, that Gavin sharpens his sword every evening and smiles, that Dietrich's hands remembered the gears even when his heart stopped. I won't forget. Not a single one. Never. Somewhere deep within the stone, right at the very foundation, something stirred. Not physically, something else. As if the earth had sighed. As if 1,000 years of silence had finally heard what it had been waiting for. Orrin's bones lay motionless, but to Artem it seemed for a second that the stone beneath them had grown warmer. Skrizzle flickered. For the last time that evening, and for a single second, Artem saw something he had never seen before. His own stats, which the tablet didn't show, and wasn't supposed to show, because it doesn't work on itself. But for just a second, one line. Loyalty of subordinates, maximum. And at the bottom, in small print, they will die for you. Try not to give them a reason. The tablet went dark, and lit up again, back to normal. Cards, numbers, data, as if nothing had happened, but it had. And Artem knew what had happened. He stood up from his knees creaked, his body ached. 8 months of training had made him stronger, but it was still Caden's body, slender, young, human. He raised the torch. He looked at Orrin's bones. He nodded, as one commander to another, as one human to another. 1,000 years later, he turned and headed upstairs, up the steps, through the corridor, through the passage in the stone, toward the light, toward the warmth, toward the people. He stepped out from beneath the tower into the courtyard. Night, snow, silence. That special kind of silence when the world sleeps and only the sentries stay awake. The sentries stood on the walls. He saw their silhouettes against the gray sky. They weren't sleeping, not because they feared punishment, because this was their fort, their home, and they stood on its walls because they wanted to stand there. Artem looked up at the sky. There were no stars, just clouds. The snow fell lightly and silently. It settled on his shoulders, on his hair, on the stone courtyard. He looked at the walls. Sturdy, intact. Holtz had built them with care. At the light in the barracks windows. Warm. Yellow. Behind the windows, people were sleeping. His people. 162. By name. Beyond the fort's walls lay the borderlands. Dark. Cold. Endless. Beyond the forests, the gray ridge loomed dark. vast, silent. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something ancient and hungry was awakening. Something that had no status, no ID card, only hunger. It was coming. Slowly, inevitable. And when it arrives, the capital will still be arguing over the regency, and the great houses will still be dividing power among themselves, and the church will still be hunting for heresy, and no one will look north, except for them, except for the fort at the edge of the world, except for the 162 people who were sent here to die, and who instead became an army, not because they were stronger, but because someone saw a human being in each of them. Artem looked at his hands. Caden's slender fingers, calluses from the quill, the sword, and the reins. Hands that couldn't lift a heavy two-handed sword, but hands that signed orders, drew up plans, and left notes saying, "Sleep a little longer." He lowered his hands, exhaled. Steam from his mouth, cold. Silence. Snow. He went to his room, his tiny cubicle on the second floor of the tower. A table, a chair, a bed, a candle, a map on the wall. Gavin's journals, Bren's reports, Leah's calculations, the map of Seon. Everything he had built in 8 months. From nothing. From 57 broken people and a crooked stone box with a hole in the wall. He lay down on the bed, closed his eyes. The tablet glowed softly in the darkness. His people's profiles, morale, loyalty, skills, potential, numbers that meant everything and nothing, because behind every number stood Bren, Magnus, Gavin, Tom, Orwin, Holtz, Kurt, Fritz, Lucas, Seon, Hannah, Minju, Eileen, Leah, Sora, and all the rest. 162 names, which he remembered, which he would remember. Tomorrow there would be a lot of work, as always. New walls, new people, new problems. Draven's lands must be claimed. Villages must be defended. The garrison must be expanded. An army must be built. A real army of a new kind, where a soldier is a person, where every name matters, where no one is expendable, and when whatever lies beyond the ridge arrives, when the capital finally wakes up and looks north, they'll see that on the farthest, most unnecessary, most despised border stands an army that won't run, because its commander knows each of them by name, and they know that he knows, and that's enough. Artem fell asleep. It had snowed all night. By morning, Fort Stone Tooth stood white and silent on its hill. Smoke from 12 stoves rose straight up into the still winter air. The sentries changed shifts at dawn. Magnus lit the stove in the kitchen. Orvin cleared his throat in the courtyard and began lining up the men for morning exercises. Hannah opened the medicine cabinet. Minju blew the bugle. Gavin sat down to write in his logbook. Leah opened her notebook. Seon stood by the wall with a mug of tea, looking eastward where the sun was rising beyond the ridge. And the commandant was asleep. 5 more minutes. Because for the first time in 8 months, he didn't have to run. Everything was running smoothly. Everyone was in their place. Everyone was doing what they knew how to do. Everyone knew why. The fort was breathing. Like a living organism. Like a home. Then he'll wake up. Get up. Do his 100 squats. Drink his tea. Read the reports. Check on the guards. Walk along the wall. He'll look at each person. The tablet will show him the cards. Numbers. Data. And behind every card, he'll see a face. And he'll remember the name. As always. Just as he promised.